Chapter 270. The weather was slightly brighter in the morning, but the air was still chilly from the previous night. When the horses and men breathed, their mouths and noses were covered in a layer of frost. At this time of the year, one could already feel the presence of winter in Tanajul. The group of men and horses passed through a valley between two mountains. The forest around them was a cold black as if it was an ink painting. Further away, the mountains behind the clouds were verdant. There were more than 30 people in the group, all of them fully armored and armed. They were all soldiers who had been released from their jobs, but they were not Erewhon's professional soldiers. They were mercenaries. In Tanajul, professional soldiers could only be seen near the Paulus region. Grodin's most elite knight were gathered at the Greyhar mountain pass, which extended to the north. After passing through the valley, the small group of men and horses entered a small clearing surrounded by forests. There was another group of men there, and they were currently escorting a few young men who were sitting on the ground with their heads hung low. When the young men heard the noise, they raised their heads and saw the stern face of the middle-aged noble leading the group. Most of their faces were filled with fear and trepidation. Only the young man in the middle of the group remained calm, though he was a little annoyed. The middle-aged noble was riding on his favorite horse, Black Fox. It was tall and had a black mane as smooth as silk. It was one of the purest horses from the north. When he was young, this horse had accompanied him through life and death. Even though it was no longer as brave as it used to be, Lord Maxon still had a deep affection for it. He lowered his head and looked at the young men without saying a word. This man was Lord Maxon, and these men were his men. Lord Maxon had received news of the rebellion in Baron Abi's territory a few days ago, but he did not immediately take action. In Erewhon, if a retainer led an army into the Lord's territory without the Lord's orders, it was considered a rebellion. Lord Maxon only ordered his knight to set out after confirming that the news was reliable. The Menta region bordered the barony of Ferber, and the army left in the morning and arrived in the evening. He gathered his men overnight, and by the next morning, they had already left the hilly region of Menta and entered the flat valley along the Gus River. Gillis Ferry was right in front of them. Earlier, the scouts had reported that the ferry was not occupied by the rioters. Many people in the town did not even know what had happened in Abis. On the other hand, the cavalry had already gone 10 miles into the coastal area, but they still didn't find any traces of the rioters. Lord Maxon wasn't too surprised. From the information he'd received, the ones involved in the riot in Abis were just a few mercenaries. These people were lawless to begin with and could do anything. These fellows, who were no different from bandits in his eyes, had most likely dispersed after a round of looting. As for further control of the ferry, they wouldn't do it unless they wanted to take over Abi's territory. Lord Maxon felt that he was overthinking things. The rioters were just a bunch of mercenaries who were obsessed with money. They wouldn't wait to be exterminated. He was originally worried that Madara was behind this since the undead army was still entrenched in the south. But now the situation was clear. This was just a riot. This was a relief to Ser Menta. However, his good mood didn't last long. A piece of news that annoyed him reached his ears through the mouths of his trusted aides. This was also the reason why he had brought more than 30 men with him to this forest. The young man in the middle of the crowd, clad in a light brown coat, with a sword at his hip, and sitting cross-legged on the ground, looking at him, resembling the knight himself, was one of his youngest sons. This youngest son was his favorite out of his 3 sons. He was quick-witted and showed signs of talent from a young age. Lord Maxon had invested a lot of effort into him, but the latter didn't appreciate it. In his early years he idled around and didn't want to do anything serious. Later on, he was sent to Brother Mahalu's territory to train in the hope that he would restrain his personality. But not only did his wish not come true, he even had some strange ideas after gaining some experience outside. The trusted aide had told him the whole story. When the rioters caught up to them, the young master planned to run away with his servants and attendants. Lord Maxon didn't know the exact reason, but when he saw the young men on the ground, he couldn't help but feel angry. "Speak," he asked from his horse, looking down at the young man. "What's the situation?" The young man sitting on the ground didn't seem to care about his prestige and raised his chin. "It's too boring, father." "Humph," Lord Maxon said in a low voice. "Didn't you want to experience war? I'll let you experience it once. But what's the situation now? You better explain it to me." "War. It's just a bunch of rioters. What kind of war is this?" The young man smiled and said with disdain. But then he raised his head and said seriously, "Father, did you know? It's rumored that Princess Griffin has returned to her territory and is gathering her knight." Lord Maxon was stunned. Even though he was a noble, his status was pitifully small. He had heard of the rumors in the north, but that was a banquet for important people. It had nothing to do with someone like him who couldn't even be considered a chess piece. "What does that have to do with you?" he asked. "Of course it does," the young man said excitedly. "The next battle will decide the fate of this country. I've already decided to throw myself into this magnificent history and follow Her Highness." Lord Maxon didn't expect his son to have such thoughts. He paused for a moment before saying, "You're dreaming. You've never left your home before, so how do you know where Her Highness is? What's the situation outside?" "I have my ways," the young man said confidently. Lord Maxon was helpless. He knew that the young man was smart since he was young, and he might be able to find a way. But he shook his head and said, "I don't care if you have a way or not, but you better think of a way to convince me first." "Father," the young man quickly stood up and said, "you can't keep me here either. Why don't you let me go out and make a name for myself? Staying in Tanajul and guarding the family's property for the rest of my life is the responsibility of your generation. As for me, a true knight should be able to make contributions in war." "War? Have you ever seen a war?" Lord Maxon couldn't help but mock. When he was young he was also a knight who followed Grodin. Even though he hadn't personally fought in a war for many years, he still retained his vigilance even after many years. He didn't care about the war that the young man kept talking about as if it had a romantic tint to it. But he suddenly stopped talking. When he was training with brother Mahalu, his youngest son had followed Lord Paulus to learn the art of war. Lord Paulus wasn't famous in Erewhon, but he could be considered a first-rate veteran in Tanajul. Lord Paulus commanded Grodin's most elite knights in the fortress at the northern edge of Mount Garahar. On one hand they had to guard against attacks from other nobles, and on the other, they had to fight against the natives of the southern border of Tanajul. Compared to the professional bandits, the bandits in Tanajul were as docile as lambs. That was why Lord Paulus was the first person who appeared in everyone's mind. Lord Maxon remembered that his son had also participated in the war between the natives and the natives. His son's experience in battle wasn't much less than his own. He shook his head and said, "All right, I'll give you a chance to convince me." "What chance?" The young man's interest was piqued. "Be my assistant and let me see your performance. If you can do this job well, I'll naturally let you go." Lord Maxon obviously didn't have such intentions. It was just a stalling tactic. He didn't have time to tangle with the young man now, and he would have time to slowly deal with him after this war. Since this young man likes to fight, I'll just throw him into the hands of that fellow. Lord Maxon naturally thought of Lord Paulus. Even though it was rumored that Grodin's two most capable knights didn't have a good relationship with each other, Lord Maxon actually had a good personal relationship with them. However, the young man understood his father's thoughts. He rolled his blue eyes and smiled. "Father, they're just a bunch of rioters. Don't you think you're making a mountain out of a molehill by doing this?" Didn't you learn the art of war from Jormat for a long time?" Lord Maxon suddenly realized that this was a good idea. He wanted to find something to let the young man waste his excess energy. He thought of a piece of unreliable news he received recently and decided to add fuel to the fire. "I heard that there's a young leader among the rioters. He's about the same age as you, but he's already a general of an army. On the other hand, you're always bragging about yourself, but you don't seem to have any amazing achievements. Now that I'm giving you this chance, don't you want to give it a try?" Lord Maxon received news that there was indeed a young leader among the rioters, but he didn't know how old he was or what kind of abilities he had. He didn't care who was the leader of the rioters. After all, they were just a bunch of rioters. He only said that to stall for time. "Goading him won't work on a knight, father," the young man said, but the look of interest on his face betrayed him. "But all right." In the end he nodded. "I agree. I'll go and see who this person is." Lord Maxon's face was expressionless, but he was laughing in his heart. The older, the wiser. No matter how smart you are, you'll still be played by me in the end. In the end, he sighed. "Young man, you're too impulsive." Author's note: sigh, all my stats including my collection are dropping every day. I feel like I've been dealt a blow. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the legal reading. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the legal reading. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the legal reading. Chapter 271. Lord Maxen naturally had to return to the army to command his subordinates after dealing with the sudden situation on his side with much difficulty. However, it was only at this moment that he could not help but rejoice. Thankfully, he was fighting against a bunch of mobs. If it was really a battle between two armies, he really could not spare the time to restrain his lawless son. But different people had different thoughts. The moment Lord Maxen turned around, the young man's subordinates surrounded him. Noticing that the patriarch's thunderous fury did not fall on their heads, they could not help but let out a sigh of relief. However, with a curiosity unique to youths of their age, they asked softly, "Young master, are we going to war?" The young man nodded and smiled nonchalantly. "Of course we're going to war. They're just a bunch of rioters. How can they be more powerful than the natives? Remember, our future enemies may be the true elites of this kingdom. As for these rioters, let them be the first stepping stones on our path forward. But from what my lord said, they seem to be very powerful. Don't worry, even the most outstanding commoners have limited knowledge." The young man snorted. "Besides, I still don't know my father's intentions. He's just stalling for time. Does he think I can't see through it? Even if he says they're powerful, they might not be powerful. But it doesn't matter. Let's see what else he can say after I've shut him up." He looked at Lord Maxen's disappearing figure and couldn't help but smile slyly. The light in the room became brighter. But the argument outside the window grew louder and louder. Brando furrowed his brows and stood up. He walked around the walnut desk and came to the window to see what was going on in the courtyard. Through the white window he saw Bosley, Amandina, and his three subordinates arguing about something. The silver elf princess stood at the side and seemed to be mediating. On the other side, Scarlet leaned on her halberd under a black pine tree. She bit on a blade of grass as she looked over, seemingly uninterested in what was going on. What's going on? Brando did not understand why these people were arguing, but after hesitating for a moment, he decided to go down and see what was going on. After all, it was not a good thing for his own corps members to quarrel. But just as he opened the door, a black shadow crashed into him. If not for Brando's quick reaction, the two of them would have collided. He took a step back and saw that it was Falerne. She also took a step back. "My lord." She sorted out her emotions and handed over a piece of paper. "What's the matter?" Brando was surprised. "What day is it today? Things are happening one after another." He took the paper and closed the door as he walked out. He lowered his head and looked at the paper in surprise. Samuel's troops have already passed Gree Ferry? The Samuel he spoke of course was Lord Maxen. Long before the battle with the subterranean dwellers, the mercenaries had already spread out along the banks of Gree River. After taking back the sawmill, Brando, who withdrew his hand, had his eyes and ears spread out between Abies and Gree Ferry. That was why the moment Lord Maxen crossed Gree River, the news had already reached him. Falerne followed behind him and nodded. "Yes, my lord." "Then shouldn't they have mobilized since yesterday? This is much earlier than the Shire expected. This guy isn't simple." Brando couldn't help but sigh. Of all the reliable people around him, the one who was most familiar with the nobles of Aween and the art of war was none other than Seal. According to the young wizard's judgment, Lord Maxen would not move too early. The rules of the game between the nobles of Aween were set in stone, and normal people would not be able to overstep them. Of course, Brando was an outsider who didn't know anything about the game. If it can't be early, then it can only be late. Judging from the indecisiveness and cowardice of the nobles in Aween, Seal had set Mentis troops to be deployed 2 days later. But now, it seems that this knight's ability is above the average of the lower nobles in Aween. "How many people are there?" Brando asked. "A few hundred, but not more than 1,000. Falerne replied expressionlessly, "But Cornelius's scouts didn't dare to go too deep into Gree River. I don't know if there are any follow-up." "Don't worry, there aren't any," Brando shook his head. "Samuel is just a retainer. How many people can he have? It's just a few hundred." He couldn't help but smile bitterly. "They look down on us. Compared to my lord's strange way of thinking, I'd rather everyone look down on us." Falerne looked at him and took the initiative to speak. Brando smiled and let go of the topic, but he suddenly remembered something. "By the way," he asked, "I thought I mentioned that there were several fords on the forested side of the river from the crossing of the Giles to the Greyhill Hill, east of here? It's a little troublesome to cross the river, but Cornelius's scouts shouldn't have any problems crossing the river, right?" "Yes, but who would want to die? That's why mercenaries are inferior to professional soldiers." Brando shook his head. "Of course I'm not talking about you. The mercenaries of Lopez are about the same." Falerne replied. Even though mercenaries were known to make a living in war, they didn't follow orders like real soldiers. In fact, they saw war as a business and would only do as much as the buyer paid them. Most mercenaries were used for a single mission in a war, and their employers were well aware of this fact. Most of them used mercenaries to make up for a temporary lack of military strength. Other than Grodin, who was a local tyrant, very few people would use them as their main force, even if most of them had outstanding personal qualities and experience. In a real war, discipline was often the most important thing. This was the reason why Brando did not reorganize the mercenaries. It was difficult to change the undisciplined nature of the veterans, so he planned to put all of them into the Amber Sword Mercenary Band, and let them perform their duties in future wars. In this era, using mercenaries was a common thing. As for his army, it would be recruited from the locals, and then he would take in a few outstanding talents from the mercenaries. To put it bluntly, he did not intend to use the mercenaries, but he only had the outline of his own army in his mind, and it was only the beginning of the blueprint that he had laid out. In his opinion, there were a lot of things to do. Brando did not receive any news from the north, but the kind knight must have received the news and started to gather his troops. With his loyalty to Grodin, the knight would definitely move his troops to them as soon as possible. However, Brando was not worried when he thought about the elite knights under Lord Paulus' command. Instead, he felt that it was a pity. They were the most professional soldiers in Tanajul, and they had been learning the art of war since young. If only they could be of use to him. Of course, he knew that it was just wishful thinking. Brando crumpled the paper into a ball and put it in his pouch. He had already let go of this matter. He knew that military matters could only be done one step at a time, just like how rice could only be eaten one bite at a time. However, he was not surprised by Lord Maxon's decision to send out his troops. The battle against the subterranean dwellers was not without a purpose. Tajiv and his tribesmen had already sealed off the area from the river to Abes. As for Lord Maxon's fate, Brando did not need to spend too much effort to think about it. A few hundred private soldiers, a few knights, and perhaps a few mercenaries against 1,000 subterranean dwellers, the outcome was obvious. "What's going on down there?" Brendel asked after putting the matter aside. Falerne shook her head. "I don't know." She saw the quarreling party when she passed by the courtyard, but she didn't pay much attention to it due to the cold indifference of a young lady. Brando nodded and did not ask any more questions. The two of them passed through the dark spiral staircase and arrived at the main hall on the first floor. Compared to a few days ago when Brando flipped out here, this place had been refurbished. Even the long table had been changed. The sounds of arguing in the courtyard became clearer. However, the first thing Brando saw was the Roman sitting at the other end of the long table. Her entire body was leaning on the table. She wore a pair of strange spectacles, and her small arms were pressed against a large pile of parchment as if she was copying something. As for the argument outside the courtyard, she turned a deaf ear to it. Of course, when the Roman heard the noise behind her, she suddenly turned around. When she saw the young man, her small face immediately bloomed into a smile. She raised her head and called out in a crisp voice, "Brando!" Brando shook his head and walked over to take off the spectacles on the girl's thin nose. He asked in an annoyed tone, "What are you doing with that look on your face?" "Settling accounts." The merchant girl raised her small chin and answered as if it was a matter of course. Brando nodded in understanding. Ever since he took over Abes, all of Grodin's private property had been taken over as spoils of war. Apart from the rewards given to the mercenaries after the war, there was also a large sum of money left behind. P.S. I'm about to vomit blood. I just uploaded it and I lost another favorite. I don't even dare to look at the subscriptions anymore. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 272. However, the management of Grodin's wealth was rather messy. On one hand, Brando had given Amandina, who was now his assistant, the absolute right to manage the wealth. On the other hand, he promised the Roman that she could use the wealth to complete the redevelopment of Tanajul's economy. Later on, even Ciara, the three commanders, and Master Smith Bosley were given limited access to the resources they needed. They didn't have to go through anyone else when they needed the resources. Brando's original arrangement was purely for convenience. Even though he was a great commander in the game for a period of time, it was done with the help of the game system. The game would systematically record the situation of the guild's deposits and withdrawals, and even set up a simple budget. However, he did not have such a helper here. In fact, he only realized that he did not have much experience in managing a territory. Soon he found that his finances were in a mess. Many things overlapped and it led to a considerable amount of conflict. In the end, the Roman personally went to Amandina and suggested that one person be in charge of managing the finances, while the other was in charge of keeping records. Only then was the management system stabilized. Brendel's financial system was starting to take shape for the first time. He glanced at the accounts. Of course, to a large extent he did not understand. Roman had her own way of keeping records. According to her, this method was taught to her by her aunt. According to the Shire, the symbols were probably a code between the witches. However, Brando did not mind. If there were anyone he could rely on, it would be Roman and Freya. After a brief glance, he raised his head again to look outside. The sounds of quarreling could be heard from outside, and it had been going on for quite some time. Yuda's voice was the loudest, Cornelius was supporting her from the side, and Bosley was only occasionally interrupting. Amandina spoke the least. Medisha, who was trying to mediate the argument, was on the verge of losing her voice. However, it seemed that no one could convince the other. "What are they arguing about?" he asked. The young Roman immediately shook his head happily, imitating Amandina's tone. "Only the master of the house knows the price of food, my lord." Brando was stunned. He had already vaguely guessed the core of the dispute outside. The dispute in the courtyard had been going on for quite some time. Amandina furrowed her brows as she looked at the people in front of her. Even though she maintained basic courtesy on the surface, she was actually annoyed to death. Of course, she would support the Lord's decision to establish his own army. She also knew that Brendel had given Janna, Rabin, the Nightsong Tiger, and Cornelius a mission. He wanted them to pick a few people from the citizens of Ferber and prepare to set up the framework for his future private army. But that was not the problem. Abes had a population of nearly 15,000. The autumn harvest was over, and the grain reserves in the city were tight. It was just enough to last them until the next month of thunder. In other words, the extra mercenaries' rations could not be guaranteed. They had to rely on trade. On the other hand, Tanajil was going to face a large number of battles. During wartime, the soldiers' rations would be doubled. Not to mention that they had to reserve food for the next spring. The men and women who worked in the fields needed a large amount of food. When all these food shortages were added together, it was quite a big problem. The subterranean dwellers in the forest also needed food. Grodin did not care about how many people starved to death in his territory, but the subterranean dwellers could not. Moreover, if he wanted to further control Abes' territory, the food shortage would be even more inconceivable. Amandina now knew that in the year of blooming flowers and summer leaves, the crops in the south of Oween were generally failing. One reason was because of the weather, and the other was because of Madara's invasion. Thus, they had to face another problem if they wanted to purchase food. This was because everyone knew that the war in the south had just ended, and the war in the north was about to break out. Erwin's sky could be said to be filled with dark clouds. The consequences of the war was that the price of food would become more stable than precious metals. In other words, the price of food would rise and it would not be just a little. As Erwin's largest free trade port, the merchants of Ampere Seal would not be unaware of the current situation. These unscrupulous merchants would not slow down even a little bit out of pity. They would only take the opportunity to drive up prices. Thus, the future of purchasing food was bleak. Amandina had rubbed her forehead many times because of this, but she still could not come up with a good solution. She had considered the silver mines in Schaflund, but as an assistant she could only make suggestions when it came to military matters. If Brando rejected this suggestion, then she could only consider the problem from the perspective of the resources in her hands. Furthermore, she knew that Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus's army was right in front of her, and her lord would not be able to free himself for a while. In fact, even the Roman lady who always did things her own way had obediently delayed her own plans. But at this time, Yuda came to her to arrange for the recruitment of a private army. First of all, recruiting soldiers required money, especially at this time of the year. Secondly, the soldiers would also need rations, and if they had to train, then the shortage of rations would be even greater. Amandina could not imagine the consequences of that. It took her a lot of effort to convince the female mercenary commander to delay the recruitment of a private army until the people in the territory settled down. Just then, Grandmaster Blacksmith Bosley arrived and asked for money. Brando originally wanted him to build a workshop as soon as possible, but whether or not the workshop was to make enchanted armor, it would first require a lot of manpower and resources. Not to mention that Tanajil did not produce iron, even the training of blacksmiths required a lot of money. Bosley, as a master blacksmith, did not need to worry about material things, so when he lacked these things, the first thought that came to his mind was, of course, he wanted it. Cornelius had yet to calm down, but Cornelius had appeared out of nowhere. Of course he wanted money as well. However, he did not come for the recruitment of soldiers, but for the funds of the mercenaries. Everyone knew that there would be losses in war. At this moment, the mercenary groups under the mercenary leaders in Ferber City could be said to be under the tree that was Brendel. They were mercenaries in name, but in reality they were a different kind of private army. Without a regular source of income, the task of replenishing their equipment fell on Brando's shoulders. Originally, Brando wanted to maintain a special relationship with the mercenaries, but since they were all in the same boat, and Cornelius knew that the mercenaries were lacking in money, he did not mention the matter of hiring them. However, the mercenaries were about to start a war, and the matter of replenishing their equipment could not be delayed, so he had no choice but to come. In order to replenish their equipment, including armor, arrows, and weapons, there was only one thing that needed to be mentioned: money. Amandina was at a loss for words. She did not have enough money on hand. But before she could think of a suitable solution, a few people started to quarrel over a few words. For a time, lines like "your business needs to be put aside," "my business is more important," were flying everywhere. Amandina was able to mediate at first, but as time went on, she could not help but join in the fight in a fit of anger. In the end, it was Medisha who ran over in a panic to mediate the situation. Only the red-haired girl who came with the silver elf princess didn't care. She simply watched from afar as these people bickered with each other, feeling bored. The quarrel between the mercenaries had reached its climax. Jana had just finished listening to Bosley's sarcastic remarks. As a member of the royal faction, Bosley was a master craftsman who had been through a lot. Naturally, his verbal skills were quite good, and he had mastered the essence of sarcasm. Jana was so angry that she wanted to retort. But just as she was about to open her mouth, her expression changed and she held her tongue. "My lord." The others were stunned for a moment before they turned their heads around. "My lord." Brando looked at them with an unperturbed expression and snorted, "It's quite lively here, isn't it?" Everyone lowered their heads. Only Bosley, who was not part of the group, had a nonchalant expression. "My lord, according to what you've said, we should have a common goal and enemy. Naturally, I'm not here to cause trouble for you. But as we all know, war is a competition of financial resources. From the looks of it, your situation doesn't look too good." "That's right, I'm afraid you're not in a good spot." Brando did not say a word after hearing Bosley's words. He naturally understood this point. Grodin's wealth might seem huge, but that was only for a commoner. It was not enough for the construction of the entire territory. For example, the construction of the city walls cost 1,000 gold a day. In fact, in order to give the workers the confidence to work for him, Amandina had no choice but to double the price. This sounded a little ridiculous because in this era, a true lord could use the labor of his citizens for free. Before the battle with Count Randner, I'm afraid every citizen here is doubting how long I can stay here. But I'm afraid that I'm not the rightful lord, and I'm afraid that I won't be able to stay here for long. In order to appease the citizens, he had no choice but to use this emergency method to get through the difficult early days. Cornelius and Rabin also suggested that he use forced recruitment to obtain labor, but this suggestion was met with unanimous opposition from Yuda and Amandina. Moreover, the acting finance minister, Roman, also disagreed with this plan. However, she was not against it for moral reasons but for economic reasons. In the long run, ruining the territory's reputation was not beneficial to the development of the territory, especially the territory's commerce. After all, Brando did not want to lower himself to Grodin's level. But the problem was not just a problem. There had to be a way to solve it. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 273. Lord Maxon's army has arrived at Gar's Ferry. Brendel was silent for a moment, but when he opened his mouth, it was this sentence. Everyone present was stunned, unable to react for a moment. Brando did not avoid Bosley's question, but the latter bowed slightly. "Since this has nothing to do with me, I'll take my leave, my lord." He followed the etiquette of Oween's nobles and placed his hand on his left chest as a sign of respect. He raised his head and reminded Brendel, "That may be the case, but my lord, I await your good news." With that, the old man walked out of the courtyard. "What's going on?" When Jana saw the detestable old man leave, she turned around and asked, "Why didn't we receive any news?" "The news was sent directly to the Nightsong Tiger," Brando replied and introduced the wild elf girl beside him. "This is Falerne, you all know her. Let her speak." Everyone's gaze fell upon the elven girl. Falern's expression did not change. She raised her chin slightly and recited the current situation unhurriedly. When they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men crossing the river, and that there were only a few knights in the group, and that some of the soldiers were mercenaries, but most of them were peasants who had yet to leave their jobs. Everyone's expression turned strange when they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men crossing the river. Wait, that bastard, there's no need for him to rush to his death. Yuta brushed her long red hair behind her neck and shook her head in confusion. He only brought so few men. We can take them all down in one go. Could it be a decoy? Cornelius asked in a serious tone. No, I think Lord Maxon didn't expect us to be so daring. Brando analyzed. Grodin's most loyal knight's men were killed in the battle with us in the inner city. The rest of his soldiers are just mercenaries and adventurers. After these people dispersed, do you think they would escape and report the news? Everyone was silent. After all, abandoning one's master and running away was not a glorious act. Especially in this era, it was very likely that one would face the danger of being hanged. Naturally, no one would run away to do such a thing that did not have any benefits. Brando continued, so the information Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus have might have come from other sources. For example, they might have heard bits and pieces of information from the refugees of Abes or even the barony. After that night, in order to prevent more people from escaping, we had already given the order to seal off the surroundings of Abes. When Amandina heard this, she continued, have your men set up layers upon layers of sentries within 10 miles of the city. As for whether Lord Maxon's spies will be able to sneak in, you know best. Yuta and Cornelius looked at each other. It was not that they were confident, but their subordinates were the most experienced mercenaries. These people weren't necessarily the best soldiers, but they were definitely the best hunters. With their rich experience, they believed that a small noble like Lord Maxon wouldn't be able to sneak his way into the city, let alone obtain accurate information. However, if they dared to blindly send out their troops based on such limited information, it was enough to show the blind arrogance of the nobles. It seemed like they did not put the commoners in their eyes at all. Brando raised his head and immediately saw Yuta and Cornelius straightening their backs. He was stunned for a moment, and could not help but feel a wave of surprise in his heart. After subduing Tajiv and its subordinates, the mercenaries had begun to realize that their status in this group was no longer what it used to be. On the other hand, the mercenaries had no choice but to rely on Brando in the face of Count Randner's revenge. So when Brendel showed enough strength, they put away their unnecessary thoughts and thought more about what kind of position they could obtain in this group in the future. Even someone like Yuta, who was not passionate about fighting for power, had to think for her subordinates. Brando smiled. There must be another reason for this. When they heard that Lord Maxon only had 600 to 700 men under his command, and that there were thousands of subterranean dwellers hiding in the forest, it meant that they had already obtained the merit. Naturally, everyone was willing to fight for it. He first looked at Yuta, then at Cornelius. In fact, Vern and his men were still at the front line, and the former Karsuk cavalry captain was the first of the 3 regimental commanders to submit to him. Before the battle at the sawmill, Vern had secretly talked to him and promised to let him command all his men. But Brendel knew that trusting one person too much would make the 2 commanders suspicious. He thought for a moment and said, "Yes, sir." He thought for a moment and said, "Mr. Cornelius, make your preparations to support Rabin. Find a way to bypass the main battlefield and cut off Lord Maxon's escape route. Capture as many captives as you can. It would be best if you can capture Samuel himself, but don't kill him. I still have some use for him." He paused for a moment. "Of course you have to judge the situation yourself. Accept my orders." The silver-haired middle-aged man's eyes lit up, and his entire body seemed lighter. He looked at Yuta, who was beside him, and replied in a low voice, "As you wish, my lord." After saying that, Cornelius straightened his sword like a true knight and bowed before leaving the courtyard. Only the sound of his footsteps could be heard as he walked back to the courtyard with a satisfied thump thump thump. Only Yuta was left in the courtyard. She could not help but frown, but she did not say anything in the end. Medisha sighed in relief when she saw that the people who were arguing had left. She bowed slightly to Brando with the elven etiquette, "My lord." Brando nodded and looked at her. The noble lady on the side was obviously relieved. The few fellows who came to ask for money were all sent away by the lord with just a few words. This made her feel as if a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. But it was just a misconception. She did not feel relieved at all because the problem would not be solved by itself. Dragging it out was not a solution. "My lord, are we not going to the front lines?" She thought for a moment and asked while hugging the documents. What's there to see? Brando shook his head. He did not see any suspense in this battle. Moreover, the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius were veterans, and it was much more effective than him going up alone. He knew that he was more suited to lead people into traps. That was his old profession, and he did not want to be a commander. Brando felt that being a lord was enough of a headache for him. As for other things, he would be lazy if he could. If he had the time, it would be better to solve more pressing problems. He turned around and asked, "How much money do we have?" "About 3.5 million Tor coins, and that's after taking into account Grodin's collection and the precious metals in his treasury." Amandina paused for a moment before she quickly replied, "But considering the time, it's not worth that much. In fact, we only have less than a third of this amount in cash." "And my lord," Amandina said with a serious tone, "the problem of food is urgent. As far as I know, Tanajal's annual output is only equal to its consumption. In other words, we do not have a single extra person and we have to think of a way to feed them." As if she was afraid that Brando did not expect this, she reminded him, "Mr. Reto is leading thousands of refugees in Port Gris." Brando did not forget this point and nodded. Amandina continued, "Speaking of food, it is not a simple matter. First, we do not have a ship. There should be a ship in Port Gris, right?" Medisha reminded in a low voice. Even though she was not familiar with the human world, she had recently studied Tanajal's geography in order to prepare for the war in the future. "Let's not talk about the fact that we don't have full control over Port Gris, and it's just a fishing port." Amandina shook her head. "There might be some merchant ships docked there, but if we want to rent them, it'll cost us a lot of money. Secondly, we cannot use all the money in our hands on one thing, and that is to delay everything that can be delayed. But at least half of it will be used for the upcoming war. To be honest, I do not know how long this situation will last, and Count Randner will definitely not let us have an easy time." Amandina sighed as she spoke, "Not to mention that even though we control Abes in name, most of the barony of Abes is not under our control. We can say that we are in a difficult situation right now." Amandina hugged the documents in her hands. "Compared to this, I would rather hide in the dark forest. Even the cleverest housewife cannot cook without rice, my lord." She looked at Brando with a resentful gaze. "As for the Magitech laboratory that you promised me, Amandina has nothing to do with it, and it can be delayed. But Grandmaster Bosley looks like he can't wait any longer." Brando could not help but smile bitterly. He knew that Amandina did not mean that she had nothing to do with it, but that she had nothing to do with it for the time being. He also knew that Amandina was telling the truth. The autumn harvest in Tanajul was over, and the only way to solve the problem of food was through trade. But at the end of the day they still lacked money. Therefore the first thing he had to figure out was how to make money. He did have a sum of money in Brags, which was left behind by the Romans' first business deal. Before they left, they entrusted this sum of money to Reto's daughter, Sue, to manage. If there were no problems, this sum of money would be at least a few 100,000 Tor coins. But with Count Randner's territory between Trentheim and Grinoires, I can't count on this money. I have to think of another way to solve this problem. The first thing he thought of was naturally Shaftren's silver mine. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 274. Shaflan's silver mine came from the rich silver reserves under Mount Greyhar. This mine extended from the Kalanga Mountains to Tanajul. It was only a small part of the Black Forest, but it was enough to benefit Erwin greatly. In fact, the real silver mine was in Tobadlan Castle, east of Mount Greyhar, on the southern shore of Green Lake. As for Shaflan's silver mine, it was only at the end of this vein. Tanajul's backwater was not just for show. "Amandina, tell me about Shaflan's situation," Brando asked. Amandina's eyes lit up. "My lord wants to make a move on the silver mine?" She immediately replied, "My lord, Shaflan has always been one of the most important sources of income in Tanajul. During the year of the cave beasts, the previous lord built a fort here to mine and transport silver. But after that, the town of Shaflan slowly became what it is today." The year of the cave beasts? Brando calculated in his mind. That was almost 30 years ago? Amandina nodded. "Currently the highest authority in this town is an adjutant and a clerk. But I found out that these two people do not report to Grodin. They are directly appointed by Count Randner. Therefore, although this silver mine produces nearly 15 tons of silver every year, our Lord Baron doesn't really get much of it. Grodin is a really useless lord." Brando could not help but sympathize with the pitiful creature. So you're asking me to touch Count Randner's cheese, Amandina? He smiled faintly. Amandina smiled back. Didn't you already touch it, my lord? Brando turned his head and saw Yuta looking at him. He noticed that even though she still maintained a reserved expression, there was a hint of anxiety in her green eyes. Seeing that Rabban and Cornelius had been appointed, Yuta did not want her people to be betrayed in the end. Even though the young lord seemed amiable, she had dealt with many nobles, both big and small. In her heart, she maintained the necessary disdain and suspicion for these fellows. Even if it was just a little, she knew how despicable these people could be when they turned hostile. Yuta pleaded with a hoarse voice, "My lord, please let me take over Schafland. I know the situation there. There are only 100 soldiers stationed in the mine." She pressed her hand against her chest. "My men and I have more than enough to take over this place." But Brando said, "But Schafland is too close to Paulus. I'm afraid that our other knight is eyeing it. Even if we attack it, we will not be able to control it in a short amount of time." Amandina was speechless. "Can't we think of a way? Even the subterranean dwellers can't use it?" Amandina asked, "Or do you not trust them?" "It's not that I don't trust them," Brando thought. He had sworn an oath to Tajiv, and the subterranean dwellers would not dare to go against it. But the purpose of taking over Schafland was to open up the mine. If Paulus harassed them from time to time, no one would be able to stand it. "How big is the shortage of food?" he asked. "We are short of 17,000 bushels," Amandina replied. Most of the units in the Amber Sword used the English system, and this world also used it. This made Brando feel extremely uncomfortable. But in terms of grain, a bushel was about 27 kilograms. He roughly calculated and found that the shortage was close to 500,000 kilograms. This was not a small number. Including our men, how long can the territory last with the amount of food in ABs? Amandina frowned slightly. "My lord, if we calculate based on the data, it can last for 2 months. But considering that there are still some food in the territory that has not been counted, it will take no more than 3 months. So there is a shortage of close to 2 months? Amandina nodded. Brando thought for a moment. That's fine. First, recruit soldiers from the citizens as usual. Also, if Bosley wants land, people, and money, give them to him. The same goes for Yuta and Rabban. But the Magicite workshop will have to be delayed. Amandina nodded again. She was just bringing it up. After all, Tanajil did not produce amber ores. The Romans' plan will also have to be delayed. Brando said again. The Roman's voice came from the back of the hall. Of course, Brando. There is no point in doing that now. Amandina did not sound dispirited. Also, we have to at least ensure that the next battle can be fought. As for the budget, you can decide for yourself. Of course, you know that the only requirement is that we don't get chased into the dark forest in the end. The girls present couldn't help but smile when they heard his words. Amandina rubbed her forehead. In truth, she really wanted to be chased into the dark forest. Of course, it was only a thought. My lord, do you have any ideas? Amandina raised her head. She was keenly aware of Brando's intentions. Of course, it's still the silver mine. Brando smiled. With such a large piece of cheese in front of us, there is no reason for us not to touch it, is there? But? Medisha seemed to have thought of something. Are you saying that we should change the method, my lord? The silver fairy princess raised her head. Her silver eyes flashed with a hint of understanding, and her eyebrows raised slightly. Brando looked at her with praise. Yes, you and Scarlet will make a trip with me. We will meet with Count Randner's subordinates. He turned to Yuta and said, Miss Yuta, you should come as well. Yuta was startled, but she immediately reacted, Do we need to bring people? Of course, but we don't need too many. Brando thought for a moment. 20 to 30 people should be enough. Amandina nodded silently, but then she felt a little strange. Brendel was clearly much younger than her, but his words made her feel as if she was a head shorter than him. It was not just because of their status, but also because he had a special aura that allowed him to maintain a natural advantage in front of anyone. She was a little uncertain, but she subconsciously thought that this young man would be the same even if he met the king. Even though this thought was a little ridiculous, Yuta subconsciously told herself that it was right. But that was not important. Brando's appointment allowed her to breathe a sigh of relief. She immediately took action. She bid farewell to Brando and went to gather her men. Amandina watched as the woman left. Do I have to go with you? Amandina turned her head and asked. She was obviously a little unwilling. After all, it was not easy for her to settle down, and she was not a person who liked to run around. You can stay. Brando saw her reluctance and replied, "Help me organize a plan while you're at it." "What plan?" "The plan to rebuild ABs." Amandina's eyes widened. Brando knew that she would be surprised, but this was one of his original plans. In his plan he would not allow the tragedy of history to repeat itself. But if Princess Griffine did not marry Duke Arek, then the royal faction's army would face defeat in the rewritten history. At that time, the northern dukes and the prince's army would be swept away. Brando hoped that at that time, the newly built city of Abes would be able to become the final fortress that could stop this terrifying army. It would protect Erwin's remaining territory south of Abes territory, especially Valhalla, which was his hope of turning the situation around in the future. Other than this reason, Abes' location was also very good. It was close to the sea to the west, and connected to the Shaflun silver mine to the east. In the future, it would also become the center of Tanajil and Valhalla. The importance of the location was self-evident. But because of the existence of Valhalla, Abes was not the ideal location for the capital. In Brando's plan, Erwin's future capital would definitely be Valhalla. But this place was more than enough to be the last solid barrier for Valhalla to connect to the outside world. In Brando's mind, Abes had to be built into a fortress, but it was not possible here. He had to choose another location. He had already ordered Tajiv and the subterranean dwellers to head north to find a suitable location to build a fortress. The ideal location not only had to be large enough to accommodate the future fortress, but it also had to be easy to defend and difficult to attack. North of the Gus River was a large area of hills, and Brando thought that it would not be a problem for the subterranean dwellers to find a suitable location. These subterranean dwellers were not good at sieges, but that did not stop them from becoming the best builders in Jorgandi Ridge. He looked at Amandina's puzzled eyes and replied, "Don't be so surprised. This matter will not be done overnight. We have 1 to 2 years and this is just a long-term plan." Building a fortress in 1 or 2 years sounded inconceivable in the real world. But it was not impossible in Wond. With the help of magic, some things were easier than expected. Of course, building a complete city in 1 or 2 years was difficult, but it was more than enough if it was just a prototype. "What do I need to do?" Amandina took a deep breath when she heard the news. Building a fortress was not a small matter. There were too many things involved, and this was the first time she doubted whether she could do it well. "It's fine. You can observe Abes for a while and think back to everything you saw in Brax. Look at how our predecessors did it and then think about what we need." Brando emphasized that the new Abes would be a fortress and he continued, "Also the Shire should be able to help you. Even though he's a wizard, most wizards come from books and simple engineering knowledge should not be a problem for him. P.S. Happy Dragon Boat Festival equals equals grade 12 students will definitely win the college entrance examination. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 275. The Shire? Brando nodded. Of course, if there are any skilled craftsmen in the city, you can keep an eye out for them. Brando thought for a moment, but he did not have much hope in this suggestion. Craftsmen who knew how to build cities were all renowned masters in this era. Even Brando himself did not believe that a remote place like Abes would be filled with hidden talents. This was not a novel, and Bosley's incident was just a special case. But when Brendel said this, he could not help but feel a little troubled. That was true. Building a fortress, especially a large one, was not like playing a game. No matter how much resources were consumed, the system would directly deduct them from the inventory. Then, with a beep, the system would place a fortress in the middle of a dense forest. In this place, clay and stone would not automatically flow up to the walls. Even a brick would have to be burned out of the kiln before it could be sent to the construction site. The labor force was not just a number. If you just put people together, they would be nothing more than a black hole that consumed a lot of food day after day. How to arrange and coordinate manpower was a very professional skill. Although simply put, it was how to let 100 people exert the strength of 100 people instead of 50 or even less people. It was very difficult to do. Brando had experience in managing a small number of people, but once the number of people rose to thousands or even tens of thousands, there was nothing he could do. After all, this was not a war. First, he had to know what these people were supposed to do. He had some of the best candidates in mind, the craftsmen of Buga, the mountain dwarves of Roland, or the gnomes of Jorgandi Ridge. They were all the best craftsmen in the world of Vaunt. But the best were not necessarily the most suitable. First of all, other than the craftsmen of Buga, Brando had no idea where to find the dwarves or goblins. The dwarves of Roland lived in the north, which was even further north than St. Tassel. The mountains there were covered in snow all year round. In Erewhon in the south there was no sign of this tribe. As for the dwarves, there were quite a few of them, but their distant relatives were wine connoisseurs and had nothing to do with building cities. As for the goblins, there was no need to mention them. The earth goblins were a noble race under Georgandy Ridge. Not only were they masters of city construction, but they were also one of the races with the best fighting skills. They did not need to come to the barren surface world to suffer like Tajiv. The only ones he could find were the craftsmen of Buga, the white-bearded old men of the Silver Alliance. Brando did not expect them to take a liking to him. Those old men were not like these country bumpkins, according to the Buga wizards, who did not know much. Brando suspected that these silver folk might have guessed his identity as a transmigrator in a few words. Brando did not have any other ideas at the moment. He could only take one step at a time. Although there was no way he could come up with a solution in a short time, as time passed and his strength increased, he might be able to find an alternative. In the end he could only add, "Go ahead and do it. I believe in your ability." It was this sentence that made the noble lady's eyes light up, and she nodded seriously. But at this moment, a young man's voice came from outside. "I think I heard you call me, my lord?" Not far away, Scarlet, who was leaning against the black pine, turned her head subconsciously and saw the Shire in a black robe coming in from outside. In fact, the young archmage rarely appeared in front of outsiders after the chaos that night. It was as if he plunged into the small room in the castle arranged for him and did not care about the outside world. Of course, according to the Shire's explanation to Brando, he was familiarizing himself with spells. After all, an apprentice would need a buffer time to become a wizard mentor overnight. Now it seemed that this guy was doing well these days. When Brando saw him, the young wizard's face was relaxed and even a little excited. It seemed that the outside world was indeed more interesting than the graveyard. Even if he stayed in a small room all day, it was no exception. "Why are you here?" Brando asked, but he immediately saw that the Shire did not come alone. There was a young man behind him. Brando recognized the young man. He was the only lucky or unlucky person left from the group of adventurers they met when they first entered Abyss. He was an apprentice who was a string magician. But this young man had been staying in the group ever since they killed Groton, which puzzled Brando. According to what he knew, this young man and his companions were from noble families. Even though they did not have much power, they were at least descendants of nobles. With such a background, there was no need for them to fool around with these mercenaries. According to Amandina's words, this group of mercenaries were rebels, but to put it bluntly, they were not far off from bandits who occupied a mountain. It could only be said that the real bandit group lacked people like him and the noble lady who understood the rules of the game between nobles. The Shire smiled and walked in front of them. He respectfully bowed to Brando. If an outsider saw a magus bowing to a noble in such a manner, their jaws would probably drop to the ground. But the young magus still greeted him meticulously, "My lord." In fact, his actions had already surprised the young man behind him. The young man who was habitually wearing a green-gray robe finally showed a strange expression and looked at the master and servant. Even though Brando was a gold-ranked swordsman, the Shire was not to be outdone. He was also a gold-ranked magus, but his status was much higher than a mere swordsman. It was the same even if Brando was a noble. Amandina, who was hugging the documents beside Brando, did not find it strange. She shook her head and acted as if she did not see anything. As for Medisha and Scarlet, one did not understand the etiquette of the humans in this era, and the other grew up in a mercenary group. Naturally, they did not have any knowledge in this area, so they were much calmer than the young man. "Actually, I'm here to ask for money," the Shire replied with a smile. He even scratched his head. You can imagine a magus scratching his head helplessly. This time, the corner of Scarlet's eye twitched. "But first, I'm here to give you money." "Give you money?" Brando was stunned. "Let's talk about money first because I know my lord is always interested in bad news." The Shire immediately answered, "The thing you asked me last time, I thought about it and it should be fine." Brando immediately reacted. Originally, he wanted this guy to form a spellcaster council similar to the Tower of Stars and Moons. After all, the Shire was now the leader of all the spellcasters in his territory. It was not impossible for him to integrate the uneven number of apprentices in the mercenary group. Even though it was a little unbearable to look at now, the future was still very promising. Even if they could not compete with the Silver Alliance in the future, at least they would not be inferior to the Black Tower Magi. The only problem was that he did not know if the Shire, as the successor of the Black Tower Magi, had any relevant taboos. When the Black Tower split from the Silver Alliance, it almost led to a war. Brendel knew how strict the wizards were in keeping their knowledge of the world a secret. When the Black Tower wizards split from the Silver Alliance, it almost led to war. Of course, this was a digression. Brando only mentioned it at that time, but he did not expect to receive an answer today. But putting this matter aside, the Shire's line of, "giving you money," really surprised him. What kind of trick was this guy playing? That was the first thing he thought. Let's talk about the second thing. Brando replied. The Shire reminded him with a smile. My lord, did you forget about the thing that I temporarily stored with me? What thing? Brando was puzzled, but the Shire took out a painting from his multi-dimensional bag. Oh my God, Martha, the painting of Princess Twilight. Amandina's eyes widened, and the document in her hand slipped to the ground. She could not help but shout in a low voice. She immediately showed a look of suspicion. This can't be a fake, right? She looked at the Shire and then looked at Brando. She thought to herself that with her lord and this mage's nature, it was not impossible. But Brando shook his head. This is the real thing. He remembered that this was the stolen item that they took in Fortress Reden. Although it was a little disgraceful, but now it seemed that the decision back then was really a wise one. Twilight's paintings were highly sought after in the collector's market, and it was not impossible to sell it for a few million Tor coins. Although this was not a lot, it was enough to solve the urgent problem. But there was no market for this item in Abyss, and if he wanted to sell it for a good price, he had to find the right place. Brando already had a target in mind at this time, and that was Erwin's only free port, Ampere Seal. He could not help but think that he really needed someone to go to Ampere Seal to take a look. Not to mention that Baron Abyss would definitely establish a trade relationship with this free port in the future. The intricate power relations there were enough to attract real political adventurers to invest in it. Especially at this time of the year with all kinds of armies pressing in, Brando guessed that Ampere Seal must be very lively right now. Thinking of this, a confident smile appeared on his face. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 276. Ampere Seal? The girl sitting on the bench looked at her best friend in shock. She was the half-fairy princess, with her long silver hair hanging loosely over her princess dress, her body as slender as a doll, and her silver eyes filled with calmness. However, this seemingly weak girl was known for her strong character in the circle of nobles. She always carried a silver dagger inlaid with emeralds. It looked like a dagger used by noble ladies for self-defense, but Magadol did not doubt that she could easily subdue a grown man with that dagger. Of course, this was still not the right way to put it. This princess was famous for her swordsmanship in the royal family. Even an official knight of the kingdom would not be her match. The girl pressed her hands on her knees and could not help but feel envious. She was also a princess from the dukedom of Manticore. She had known Griffin since young and the two had always been close friends. However, she was envious of Griffin's ability to naturally show her strength. Even the smallest details in her movements showed the princess's extremely independent character. In comparison, she had grown up learning strict aristocratic etiquette. Although she was well-educated and knowledgeable, outsiders had always seen her as a gentle, quiet, and elegant young lady. It could even be said that she was the role model of most noble ladies in Wond. However, Magadol did not like such praise. She wanted to be free to pursue the life she wanted. However, she did not know what kind of life she wanted. Furthermore, her serious character forced her to take responsibility for her own destiny. The dukedom of Manticore was just a small country in the north of Erwin. For a girl like her, her future was already set in stone. Why do you suddenly want me to go to Ampere Seal, Griffin? Is it because of the war? The half-fairy princess nodded her head. Suddenly, there was a loud commotion outside the balcony. Knights were sparring in the square outside. However, the commotion quickly subsided, and it did not affect the conversation between the two in the room. Has the situation become so tense? Magadol asked softly. What do you think, Teeny? My brother's actions are faster than I thought. The dukes have already formed an alliance. Although that old fox Arek is still hesitating, I think he will make a decision soon. The silver-haired girl explained unhurriedly, as if she was talking about something that had nothing to do with her. Maybe there is still a chance, Griffin? Magadol could not help but say. It's not that simple, Teeny. Arek has always been ambitious. He wants to stand with my dear brother or stand with us. The half-fairy princess paused for a moment and said faintly, I don't mind the marriage, but I am worried that it will harm Haruz. Thus, the young girl sitting opposite her no longer spoke, but looked at her calmly. The two of them were close friends and understood that the other would not be stumped by this little difficulty. Griffin would not be Erwin's princess if she did. Actually, my main concern is Count Randner, the silver-haired girl lowered her voice. If Duke Arek is like a dark cloud in the northern sky that can bring a storm at any time, then as long as the wind is blowing in the right direction, he may not necessarily be our enemy. He can also be our ally. But I suspect that Count Randner will draw his dagger at us from behind at any time. Magadal's brown eyes flashed with interest and she suddenly said, I heard something that you might be interested in, Griffin. Go ahead, Teeny. The princess of the Manticore Dukedom leaned closer to Griffin. I have a friend who just sent me a magic letter from Count Randner. He said that Count Randner seems to be in some trouble, and there are some rebellions in his territory. I think he might not have the time to care about things outside of his territory for the time being. Is it a friend from the Holy Cathedral? The half-fairy princess asked seriously. Magadal nodded slightly. The silver-haired girl looked at her close friend seriously. Even though she did not have any elven blood, her beauty was not inferior to her own. However, they were completely different. Her soft golden hair seemed to be plated with a layer of holy radiance under the soft light, setting off her quiet and gentle face. It wasn't without reason that this young girl was called the Frowning Angel, although such beauty was extremely rare among humans. Griffin could not help but think of an ancient human kingdom's queen. But the queen's fate was too tragic, and this made her frown slightly as she shook her head and threw the thought out of her mind. Magadal herself was an extremely devout believer, and she was very close to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. At the same time, she also maintained a very good personal relationship with many of the priests in the Holy Cathedral. Because of her close relationship with the Holy Cathedral, she was jokingly called the Nun Princess by many nobles. The High Priest of the Holy Cathedral had publicly praised this girl's devotion to her faith, and it was also because of this that the Nun Princess was not harassed because of her beauty. This was because the reality was often like this. Between royal authority and divine authority, the former made people yearn for it, while the latter was more revered. Teeny, do you remember a joke we heard when we were learning about royal etiquette? The half-fairy princess suddenly asked. In Erwin, there is no lord who does not deal with a rebellion or two. Otherwise he is not a true lord. Magadal smiled slightly, most likely because Griffin's words reminded her of the carefree days of the past. It's actually the same everywhere, Griffin. Yes, the silver-haired girl nodded, so don't put your hopes on others. Let's just hope that Count Randner will be flustered for a while. But we still have to do what we have to do. Then what can I do, Griffin? I hope that you can use your relationship with the Holy Cathedral to persuade the merchants of Ampere Seal to reject the Alliance's request. The half-fairy princess replied, Teeny, the free port is under the protection of the Holy Cathedral. They have the ability to do so, but I'm worried that the merchants will be tempted by the benefits. I know the presiding priest of Ampere Seal, I can give it a try. Magadal thought for a moment and asked, But when do I have to leave, Griffin? There's no need to rush, Griffin said. Once you leave my place, I'm guessing that the dukes will immediately receive the news. This is a dangerous matter, Teeny, you have to think carefully. Although you are my good friend, I don't want you to get into any trouble. That's why I want to help you, Griffin. Thank you. The silver-haired girl looked at the direction of the balcony, and the loud cheers from before rang out once again. This meant that one of the battles had been decided. Her silver eyes flashed. Let me help you choose a few people who can complete this mission with you and protect your safety, Teeny. Then of course I want Sister Maynard. Magadal's face revealed a rare sly look. She would only reveal this side of hers in front of Griffin. If she's with me, I'll have someone to chat with and relieve my boredom. The princess smiled. You're not the least bit courteous, taking away my best knight. But since that's the case, I can only reluctantly part with her. But you have to take good care of Sister Maynard. Her temper is much worse than mine. Of course. Magadal blinked. In reality, the three of them were close friends who had known each other since they were young. They understood each other's personalities the best. Although Maynard was born with a cold temperament, she was not someone who would throw a tantrum at others. At this time, cheers rang out from outside the balcony again, drowning out all the sounds in the room. This time it was different from the previous times. The cheers did not stop for a long time, and the two who were familiar with all of this understood that this meant that the final stage of the night tournament was about to begin. The half-fairy princess was distracted by the cheers. She raised her head, her silver eyes sparkling. After a while, she opened her mouth. Let's go, let's see which outstanding young people are lucky enough to be with Teeny. Magadal smiled and nodded. The second round of the tournament was about to begin. Freya's palms were sweaty, and her heart was pounding. If the audience outside the balcony could take a closer look at the face of this girl from Wuxia, they would definitely notice that her face was as red as a ripe apple. She was panting heavily, sweat dripping down her sharp chin, and the back of her uniform was already soaked. The consecutive battles had taken a toll on the future Valkyrie's stamina. She had defeated many opponents along the way and had attracted the attention of many people. As a new member of this batch of young students, her performance could be said to be outstanding. However, Freya knew that she was not the only one like this. On the other side of the balcony, Breton and 3 other students had also become the most dazzling existences of this batch of young students. She wiped the sweat off her chin with her hand. Compared to them, she could be considered as the least outstanding one. In the previous battle, Breton only used 3 moves to defeat his opponent, a member of the Knight Reserve who was 1 level higher than him. When Freya saw this scene, she realized that the impulsive and immature youth in the past had become much calmer and more mature. His swordsmanship had also improved to such an extent. Freya could almost imagine Breton's amazing talent shining brightly on his sword. He had found his place, and this was the best stage for him to show off his skills. However, compared to him, she was still a little confused. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.jidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 277. Freya knew that she did not have that kind of talent. Ever since she was in Wuxia, she used her unyielding personality to make up for the difference. She put in a lot more effort than others and slowly made up for the difference between people. But things were not as simple as she thought. As time passed, Freya gradually realized that the difference between people was not something that could be made up with hard work. Just like in this academy, there were too many capable people, and she was simply insignificant in this crowd. She was like a tiny firefly under the bright moon, and the little bit of pride she had in Wuxia had completely disappeared. In front of her was a knight student from the upper year. He had the strength of a middle silver-ranked knight, and was on par with Breton. In fact, if this competition did not limit the strength of the participants to the peak of iron-ranked, she would have already fallen to the ground. But even so, she could feel her hands trembling as she gripped her sword. The upper-year student who was frowning was also carefully circling around her. Freya's tenacious fighting style had caused him to suffer quite a bit. The annual championship competition of the Royal Cavalry Academy had a rule that everyone complained about. There was no time to rest between matches, and everyone had to pay the price for wasting too much energy in the previous battle. It was said that the founder of the academy set this rule to let the students understand that no enemy would give them reasonable rules on the battlefield. They had to learn to conserve their energy, and only then would they be able to survive longer on the battlefield. The original intention of the Royal Cavalry Academy was to send the best military talents to this ancient kingdom. In times of peace, the students who graduated from the academy were all trained as middle and high-ranking officers. Those who graduated with excellent results were even selected to enter the Royal Knights Regiment the moment they stepped out of the academy's gates. Thus, there were many people who reached the heavens in a single bound. Just like this annual championship competition, the Knights competition was carried out using a point system. Students of different years would be able to obtain a corresponding amount of points by fighting, and a cruel elimination system was implemented. Only the person who stood at the end would receive the highest honor of the academy, the title of Champion Knight. And after the Champion Knight was decided, the best knight of each year would be selected based on the points. Basically, these people could be branded with the mark of nobility. Even though this system was not very fair, but it was a true reflection of the life and death struggle on the battlefield. Just like a famous quote from the founder of the academy, "Luck is not only your strength, but it is also one of your greatest reliance." This sentence was the most appropriate to describe Freya. She was only an iron-ranked, and this speed of improvement was considered rare for a normal person. It could be said that it was the greatest affirmation of her hard work, but in this situation, Freya felt that she did not have any extra strength to react to her opponent's movements. She could only barely keep up with the other party's circling movements and pray that luck would favor her, or perhaps a miracle would be more appropriate at this moment. Her opponent seemed to have noticed this as well. After carefully confirming that she was not deliberately deceiving him, the senior student decisively launched an attack. The sword came from the back of her right side, which was the hardest to guard against. Freya did not think much of it, or rather she did not have the strength to think much. She raised her sword. It was almost an instinctive action, but as if she had a mind of her own, she let the opponent's sword pass through the handle of her long sword. She felt a burning sensation on her hand, and her opponent was slightly stunned. Freya did not even think about it and twisted her hand, pulling the sword from the handle of the cage. While he was still in a daze, she went up to him and elbowed him in the chest. The student was sent flying, but when he got up again, Freya's sword was already on his neck. "What kind of swordsmanship is that?" the student asked as he got up. He saw the bright red blood dripping down from the girl's hand, and it was somewhat dazzling. Freya did not answer. In fact, she was a little confused. The last move she used just now was obviously a move that she remembered Brando had used before. When she first saw Brando use it, she did not think it was very exquisite, but now that she thought about it, it was very practical. But she thought that if it was Brando who used it, she would not have hurt her hand. "I admit defeat." The senior student who was sitting on the ground was stunned for a moment, and finally raised his hand. Then Freya saw the female knight who was the referee walk in. As usual, the latter separated the two with a cold face, and then turned to look at her. "I heard that you have been on the battlefield?" Maynard asked in a cold voice. Freya noticed that there was a trace of deep suspicion in her eyes. She rarely saw unnecessary emotions in those dark eyes, as if the female knight was always wearing a cold mask. But at this moment the mask was a little loose. The girl was a little confused, but she still nodded. In the Royal Cavalry Academy, there was no one who dared to go against this senior. "Is it related to Madara's undead?" "Yes." "The swordsmanship you used just now, can you still use it again?" Freya hesitated for a moment. She felt that she was about to faint. But Maynard also saw her embarrassment and did not insist. Instead she said, "That move just now had the shadow of Erwin's military swordsmanship, and it was not the same as the knight's swordsmanship taught in the academy." "I heard that you were once a militia?" Freya nodded again. "But no matter if it is the militia swordsmanship or the guard swordsmanship, it is not a straightforward killing move. It is more like the real Erwin swordsmanship." The black-haired female knight frowned and looked at her deeply. "You are from Wuxia? Do you know anyone in the White Mane Army?" Freya was stunned. She did not know why this senior who usually took care of her would keep asking her these strange questions. Of course she shook her head. But the current Freya was no longer the ignorant country girl from Wuxia. She had gained a lot of knowledge after studying for a few months. She recalled the move just now and the swordsmanship Brando used. It seemed that they all had one thing in common. To put it simply, it was concise. It was an extremely concise swordsmanship, as if it did not need any extra moves, as if it was purely used to win. Freya could imagine the effect of this swordsmanship on the battlefield. No wonder Maynard called it a killing move. She recalled that Brendel's every move was swift and clean, and his speed was astonishing. But when she came back to her senses, she saw Maynard's pair of dark eyes staring at her. She was shocked. She had never seen this side of Maynard. But after a while Maynard said, "Actually, that was not a pure Erwin battle formation swordsmanship." Freya was stunned. Her heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? "Are you hiding something, Freya?" The girl quickly shook her head, causing her ponytail to sway. "All right, that was a modified version of Erwin battle formation swordsmanship." Maynard straightened her body and said with a strange expression, "I've seen this swordsmanship before." Freya watched as Maynard turned around and walked to the other side of the arena after she finished speaking. However, her face slowly turned pale. She suddenly thought of a possibility. This woman knew Brando. Who was that? The half-fairy princess turned around. "Who?" "The student who won just now." Magadol looked at the crowd below and said, "I saw Maynard talking to her for a while. She seemed to be a girl." Griffin followed Magadol's gaze and understood. "That's Everton's daughter." The silver-haired girl sighed. "Unfortunately, it seems that she did not inherit her father's talent. Although she is already very good, she is not the best in this batch of students. Compared to her father, she is still far behind." "Griffin, that's because the quality of this batch of students is too good." Although the nun princess was not an expert in swordsmanship, her wisdom and experience made up for the gap. "That young man called Breton, and the other two people, I've heard you mention them more than once." The silver-haired girl smiled. "Yes, Lady Martha is still protecting Erwin." She continued, "I'm going to pick out the best students from the upper and lower grades to go with you to Ampere Seal, Teeny. Both Oberway, and I think it's necessary to train the students in this cohort. Let them leave Ampere Seal and train. That's my idea." "So you have your eyes on that Breton, Griffin?" Magadol turned her head and asked. "He is indeed a very calm young man. There are very few people like him among the nobles." "Not necessarily, Tinny," the silver-haired girl's eyes flashed. I know there is one more. He let me know that the blood of Erwin's ancestors has not dried up, so there is still hope for this ancient kingdom. It's rare to hear you praise someone like that, Griffin. The half-fairy princess did not answer her friend's question. She was thinking about the young man that Oberway mentioned. She had already confirmed that he did not come here with Freya. What a mysterious guy. She did not know where he was and what he was doing, but she had a faint premonition that he would not be willing to be left alone. He would soon appear in front of everyone again. As for how he would appear? The silver-haired girl smiled in her heart and threw away this strange thought. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 278. Along the banks of the Gree River, the sky was gradually brightening. In the forest, Rabin and the Nightsong tiger were hiding under the bushes, silently watching the noble's army pass through the forest noisily. This was not surprising, as even the regular army of the kingdom could not achieve such a high level of discipline. Of course, mercenaries were much better. At least they had the awareness of being ambushers. Hundreds of mercenaries were holding their breaths and hiding along the banks of the Gree River, waiting for the last noble soldier to enter the predetermined battlefield. Hundreds of crossbows, long and short bows, were about to aim at the prey that was entering their shooting range. Although these guys don't seem to be very strong, the Nightsong tiger said as he looked out of the forest, but these scouts are still very experienced, they just lack some combat experience. The leader of the Fireground Corps glanced at the man beside him. He knew that this man did not have a name, only a nickname. He had never heard of the Nightsong bird before. You only lack a little combat experience? You're the only one who dares to say that. Rabin couldn't help but think. As a former captain of Karsuk's cavalry, Rabin was much more knowledgeable than the average person. He was well aware that Maxon's scouts were top-notch even in the regular army. However, this man and his mercenaries were too powerful. He saw with his own eyes how the mercenaries of Lopez killed a group of noble scouts. They leaped up, mounted their horses, killed them, and threw away the corpses in one go. The corpses of the noble scouts were still lying in the forest, with only their body temperature left. However, the dead could not stand up and complain about the words of the mercenary leader. The former captain of the cavalry could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. That level of courage and tacit cooperation made him wonder if these guys were really mercenaries. And this guy was only the young lord's servant. He probably wasn't even a knight. Of course, Rabin could not guess who Brando was, but that did not stop him from making a judgment. As a veteran captain of the cavalry, he was more observant than most people when it came to details. When Brando captured Grodin, he already knew that this young man was extraordinary before Yuta and Cornelius. At the same time, he was also the first to suspect Brando's intentions. A noble like Brando did not need to come to such a remote place, right? So what was his purpose? Rabin might seem like a careless person, but he was keenly aware of Brando's ambitions, which was why he sided with him from the start. After leaving Karsuk's cavalry, he worked tirelessly to establish this mercenary group. Of course, he was not someone who was willing to be ordinary. Rabin had been looking for someone to serve among the nobles for a long time, but most of the time, the people he looked up to would look down on him. Most of the people who looked up to him were people like Grodin, who was despised by the nobles. That was until Brando presented him with this opportunity. The two of them hit it off immediately. While Rabin was lost in his thoughts, the nobles' army slowly entered the forest. After crossing the Gree River, Lord Menta slowed down. Although it seemed like the rioters did not stay behind, he was a cautious person. There was nothing wrong with being careful. However, this cautiousness did not come from his innate sensitivity towards war and military matters, but from his personality. That was why when his youngest son caught up to him, Lord Maxon still had his mercenaries and private soldiers move forward through the forest by the riverside. The noises made by the soldiers along the way annoyed him. However, there was no point in restraining them. At most, he could only control them for a while. Instead, he looked at the knights around him and felt a little satisfied. These knights were his old subordinates and were truly seasoned warriors. Even though they were covered in armor, their calm eyes were constantly observing the surrounding forest under their masks. They always held their swords and maintained the necessary vigilance. A true knight was a professional soldier who had practiced the art of war for a long time. Naturally, they were different from others. Even their attendants, the noble soldiers who followed behind the gigantic dragon mounts and waved various banners, seemed to be better trained than the mercenaries. But that was just how it looked. Lord Maxon instinctively frowned when the group entered the narrow path between the forests. But just as he was thinking about whether they would encounter any trouble, the sound of horses galloping could be heard from behind him. There were only his second son's men at the back of the group. He had personally assigned them to him. There were a total of 50 men, and he thought that it would be enough for him to deal with them for a while. However, he didn't expect that the other party would be able to make these people obedient. This was beyond his expectations. What new tricks did that kid come up with? With that thought in mind, Lord Maxon turned around and saw the familiar face that made the corners of his eyes twitch as he chased after him on horseback with a few men behind him. Samuel loved and hated his son at the same time. When Carglass approached the group, he pulled on the reins and slowed the horse down. The young man stood upright on the horse in the most standard knight posture, like a straight sharp knife. He casually pushed the messy hair on his forehead to the side and let out a sigh. "Father. What's wrong?" The young man smiled shyly and asked, "Father, how long has it been since the scouts came back?" Lord Maxon was startled as he realized the problem. However, he did not want to admit it and asked in a displeased tone, "Why do you ask? They're only a little late. They might have gone too far. You know that my men always have too much energy." Carglass raised his head and glanced at the forest. "Not necessarily," he said casually. "You little bastard." Lord Maxon cursed in his heart. "What are you trying to say?" Carglass couldn't help but chuckle as he stared at his father with a strange expression. Everyone says that Lord Maxon is a cautious person, but that's not necessarily the case. Before he could finish his sentence, he noticed that Maxon's expression was getting darker and darker. "But father, aren't you a little too bold? You knew that there was a problem with the scouts, but you still allowed the army to enter the forest?" Carglass quickly changed his words. Although that was what he said, he didn't seem to be worried at all. After all, their opponents were just a bunch of rioters. No matter how strong they were just a bunch of mobs. The young man thought highly of himself and naturally did not put Brando's mercenaries in his eyes. Of course, if he knew what kind of danger was lurking in the forest, he would not think that way. "Since when did you have the right to lecture an old man like me?" Lord Maxon interrupted him. "You weren't even born when I was fighting." Yes, father. Let's stop the army first." Lord Maxon looked around and was a little worried, but at least he found a way out. He raised his hand and the messenger immediately passed down his order. After a short commotion, the army stopped. But once they stopped, Carglass immediately noticed that something was wrong before the experienced knight. He raised his head and looked into the forest, frowning deeply. It was not only him. When the young man smelled that something was wrong, the other knight present also sensed that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Rabban also frowned. That noble had stopped outside the ambush circle. If he had just a little bit more time, he could have taken the initiative to attack. But this matter was suddenly suspended in the air. He took a deep breath and stared at every detail outside the forest. After some thought, he decided to wait a little longer. In his career as a Karsuk knight, Rabban learned that he had to remain calm on the battlefield. This was how he could see the situation clearly and win the final victory. But this time he was wrong. The Nightsong Tiger also stared in that direction. He had already sensed that something was wrong. It was not normal for the noble's army to stop as soon as the horsemen entered the group. He first suspected that the enemy had discovered their presence. But whether or not the enemy had discovered them, he knew that he had to make a decision. The subterranean dwellers were about 100 meters away from the noble's army. They were equipped with the four-armed crossbows given to them by the humans for the first time. Tajiv had always wanted these weapons, but Grodin was not foolish enough to hand them over to his enemies. Of course, it was a different story when they joined Brando's group. 100 meters was a long distance for a human. Even an iron-ranked warrior would need a few seconds to cross this distance, let alone in the forest. But it was enough for the subterranean dwellers. The Nightsong Tiger made a decision. "Send the signal," he ordered in a deep voice. "Wait," Rabban was puzzled. "The distance is too far. They haven't entered our ambush yet. We have the absolute advantage in numbers and strength. The ambush is just icing on the cake," the Nightsong Tiger answered decisively. "But if we wait for them to react, the situation will be out of our control. My lord wants to capture that knight. That is the main point of this battle." The Nightsong Tiger continued. Rabban was stunned for a moment before he understood. It was indeed so. P.S. As Long Kong's hooligan student wishes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 279. Retreat. Carglass stared into the forest, his expression turning serious. What? Lord Maxon could not believe his ears. His youngest son actually wanted him to retreat. Even though it was fine to be cautious, wasn't this making a mountain out of a molehill? What would happen to his father's reputation? Brat, this old man isn't dead yet. It's not your turn to command. Lord Maxon coughed sternly and reprimanded Carglass. My lord, I'm afraid the young master is right. At this moment, the knight beside him spoke with a grave expression. It's best if we retreat. What's going on? Lord Maxon was stunned. His old subordinates would not joke about him. This time even he started to panic. But just as he finished speaking, everyone heard a shrill cry coming from the forest. The young man subconsciously raised his head and saw a conspicuous magic signal slowly rising in the air. Good heavens, are they really rioters? This was the only thought in Carglass's mind. A day and a night had passed since they left Abyss. Beyond the blue-black peaks, the party stood on the summit, and the view extended in all directions with the earth. The fields formed a green checkered rag, which stretched away through the winding valleys. Brando did not expect Mount Greyhar to have such a scenery and could not help but be startled. That's Schaflund. Janna looked down the mountain path. Red roofs dotted the forest like stars in the sky. They gradually became denser, forming a settlement. The small town was sleeping peacefully in the mountains. It was close to noon, but they had already arrived. Although Seal's words before he left opened up a whole new line of thought for Brendel. As a free trade port, Ampere Seal was a place full of gold, and he didn't only have Ramona in his hands. Not only did he have Ramona's paintings, but he also had a future master alchemist. Coupled with the experience he brought from the game, it would not be difficult for him to earn a bucket of gold from the free trade port. Even though he had to go to Ampere Seal, Schaflund's silver mine was also a long-term matter. Thus, Brando did not change his plans and came to this mining town in the mountains. How beautiful! Scarlet muttered when she saw this scene from behind. At this moment, the bushes behind them rustled as mercenaries came out of the forest one after another. There were a total of 27 of them, each of them steady as they looked around with sharp eyes. These people were all at least at the peak of iron rank, and they were all elites under Yuta's command. In order to gather enough people, the female mercenary leader had even borrowed quite a few people from other small mercenary groups. To be honest, Brendel was taken aback when he saw them. The peak of the iron rank was already at the threshold of the silver rank. These people only needed to be trained a little and they could become masters of their own. Even a well-trained knight could not compare to them. But compared to his own luxurious lineup, these people paled in comparison. Not to mention Brando himself, everyone here knew that the two girls beside the young lord were golden warriors. There were also two silent attendants. They were actually angels, but their snow-white wings were too eye-catching, so Brando asked them to keep them. They were also lower silver rank. To Brando, it was too wasteful to summon holy angels after shuffling them into his deck. Although he did not have a lot of cards in his deck, it was still easy to draw this card. However, Brando did not have an effective way to replenish his light EP, so he simply left the two angels outside. He would rather spend one light EP per day since he did not need to use the resurrection cards for the time being. He was thinking of throwing the two angels back when he only had 5 light EP left. It would be enough to leave one chance for him to resurrect the angels. The 100 wealth he saved when he subdued the subterranean dwellers could finally be used to unseal the Fire Elemental Land card, Ember Volcano, and the Wind Elemental Land card, Nest of Storms. At this moment, an extinguished volcano and the Eye of the Storm that was constantly spinning in the sky were already lying quietly in the independent space he created with his mind. The only land card left in the card book was the Fire Elemental Land card, the Wasteland of Carado. With the Wind Elemental Land card, summoning the Wind Spirit Spiders was no longer a burden. The Fire Elemental Land card allowed him to aim for a card in the deck. Fire Djinn, Scorching Hell X, 15 Fire EP, creature, Elemental Djinn, level 36 creature, tap, let the Fire Djinn deal great damage to your enemy and shuffle it back into the deck. When the Fire Djinn is on the field, pay 2 Fire EP per day. On the Scorching Earth, the Fire Djinn always makes its enemies tremble in fear. Purchase requirement, pay 50 Fire EP. The purchase of this card required Fire EP and not wealth. This was extremely attractive to Brando, who urgently needed wealth to unseal the resource, Cards of Fate. Although 50 Fire EP was a little too much for Brando's Fire EP pool, which only had 37 slots, it did not matter. As an elementalist who leaned towards the fire element, all he needed to do was to practice his fire element spells and his Fire EP pool would slowly expand. Fortunately, when he was leveling up his elementalist, the initial spells he chose were all fire element spells. Fire arrow and the like did not consume too much of his mana. Apart from that, another card that he had planned for a long time entered his vision. Silver Swallowtail Flag, Guild of Light 7, 12 Earth or Water, Treasure, Fantasy Wonder. When the Silver Swallowtail Flag is on the field, all creatures on the field have their upkeep cost reduced by 1. If there are multiple upkeep costs, choose one of them. Tap to select a card and double the amount of wealth it produces. Flowing Silver. Purchase requirement, pay 100 wealth. Brendel had been drooling over this card for a long time, and he even hesitated for a long time on whether it was the land card or this card. It was only when the Shire gave him a suggestion that he made up his mind. No matter what, a Planeswalker's power was based on the Earth cards. What are we going to do next? Scarlet rested her halberd on her shoulder and looked back at Brendel. Brendel could not help but worry that the girl's small shoulders would not be able to bear the weight. Before Brando could say anything, the mercenary leader spoke first. Shaflund is a small town that developed because of the silver mines. Most of the people living here are miners. The prosperity here is based on the basic necessities of the miners. There are many shops and inns in the town. There are inns in a place like this? The red-haired girl interrupted her. It's not strange. Shaflund is also the furthest place in the Greyhar Mountains. There are many adventurers who visit this place. It's rumored that there is an open-air silver mine in the forest. Many people who come here dream of getting rich. An open-air silver mine? The Roman's voice came from behind them. Is there really such a thing? Everyone turned around and saw Romaine was the last one to come out from the bushes. She was still holding onto her skirt to prevent it from getting caught on a branch. But this time she did not come out alone. Brando had asked her to come with him. There were many accounts in Shaflund's silver mine. It was good that she was self-taught. Other than Amandina, only the Roman knew how to read these accounts. It is said that there is an open-air silver mine in the forest. Some people have seen it before and some have even made a fortune from it. But that is only a small number of people. Most people return empty-handed. Yuta replied. Even so, there are still so many people coming here? Scarlet was puzzled. I heard that there are several inns here? People will only see a small number of successful cases. Brando looked down at Shaflund and continued. Even though Yuta felt that the grammar of Brendel's words was a little strange, she had to agree that it was the truth. She nodded. My lord is right. What's more, those adventurers who made a fortune just threw their money on the gambling table and lost it all in the blink of an eye. Things that come easily will be thrown away easily. Medish's voice was soft and gentle. She used an ancient elven proverb to describe the situation. Everyone couldn't help but nod in agreement. But the Roman expressed a different opinion. If there are people who made a fortune from this, then it must be real, right? She seemed to be unable to forget about the open-air silver mine. My aunt always said that a man's wealth is his own ruin. This kind of thing will definitely attract the attention of the nobles, right? Even Count Randner's subordinates would be tempted by the open-air silver mine. But no one who discovered the open-air silver mine went into the forest to find the vein. Yuta shook her head. This is also the mysterious part of the forest. The Roman's eyes widened. It was obvious that she was extremely curious about this matter. Scarlet swung her flame-like ponytail and pouted. Gods and ghosts, most of them are fake. Those who made a fortune might not necessarily have discovered the open-air silver mine. Maybe it's just a rumor. That's a possibility. Brando thought of another possibility, but he intended to return to the main topic. But let's talk about our plan first. Yuta, you're the most familiar with this place. Tell me what you think. My lord, 2 miles northeast of Shaflund is the mining area. Every morning, the workers will go through a specially open mountain path to enter the mining area. There are many towers along this path, and there are also light cavalry patrolling the area. It's impossible for us to walk in openly. Is that the only way? Brando asked. With our skills, how likely is it that we can sneak in through the mountains? It's not impossible, Yuta thought for a moment, but I heard that the guard captain of the mining area is a gold-ranked swordsman. Brando nodded. It would be strange if there's no expert in this place. After all, the highest defense officer in the mining area is a sword saint who has awakened his elemental energy. That's good, he replied. Compared to the heavily guarded mining area, entering Shaflund isn't a difficult task. There are quite a lot of people here, so we won't attract too much attention if we split up and enter separately. Everyone remember to bring your own funds and check in at the inn. Brando looked at the sky. We'll gather again in the evening. Have you memorized the marks we agreed on? Everyone nodded in agreement. Then let's move out. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.jidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 280. In the center of Schaflund, there was a tavern called Forest Trout. The owner of the tavern was an ordinary middle-aged man, but the ale sold there tasted really good and attracted a lot of regular customers. Most of them were local workmen who worked 6 days a week and could come back to town on Sundays to relax. Workmen from the mines, stinking of sweat, invariably boisterous, and without exception rude and loud, heedless of what other people thought of them, commenting in small groups on the figure of some waitress. If any of the waitresses in the tavern gave them a flirtatious look, they would definitely be booed. But there were a few youths drinking in the corner of the tavern, looking at them from the corner of their eyes while discussing their own matters. Most of them were born here, their parents were workers in the mines and so were they. But the restlessness of youths made them unwilling to spend the rest of their lives in this place. They discussed with each other and decided to leave this place and explore the outside world. But they were born in this town, and the furthest they went was the nearby forest. At most, they could only guess what the outside world was like from the words of the adventurers outside. The youths discussed for a while, and just as they were about to set a time, they heard a cold snort coming from beside them. The young people were slightly startled and turned their heads guiltily. They saw an old dwarf sitting at another table not far away. Just like in most fantasy stories, this old dwarf had a conspicuous big nose and a long beard that reached below his waist. His hair was braided and tied with an iron ring, and his arms and legs were very thick and strong. But his skin wasn't the healthy reddish-brown of the hill dwarves. Instead, it was a light gray color. The young man's expression changed when he saw the dwarf. This old man was called Odom, and they didn't know where he came from. However, it was said that he was very capable and had gotten a job as a steward for the chief of this place. But his temper was really bad. He was stubborn and inflexible, and he never gave anyone a good face. His situation wasn't very good either. He was often seen drinking alone. Even though dwarves loved to drink, they rarely drank alone. Unlike this old dwarf, his temper would get worse after drinking, and he would keep a straight face and ignore everyone. Furthermore, this fellow was extremely arrogant and looked down on everyone. Someone had once heard him speak ill of the scribe. However, this old dwarf was so angry that he even dared to scold the king, so this matter didn't attract much attention. When the young man saw that it was him, he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. "Old Odom, so you're here," one of the more quick-witted ones quickly said in a friendly tone. The old dwarf glanced at the young people and asked, "What's wrong? Are we bothering you?" No. The person who reacted quickly immediately said, "How could that be? We want to treat you to a drink, but..." The old dwarf snorted and said, "Who cares about your stupid business? But let me remind you, young man, the outside world is not so simple. Be careful not to bump your head and come back bleeding." The few youngsters immediately felt as if they had been granted amnesty. They stammered in response and then went to pay the bill in a hustle and bustle, and hurriedly left through the front door. When they left, they couldn't help but curse their bad luck. Why did they meet this old man? Fortunately, he didn't have a good relationship with most of the people in town, or else he would have run over and told their parents, and they would probably be beaten up badly. The old dwarf shook his head as he watched the young people leave. The outside world was not that easy to explore, but the young people were hot-blooded, so he did not care about these things. Just as the old dwarf was about to lower his head and drink some wine, he was startled. He saw 3 men and 4 women walking in from outside the inn. In fact, when Brando opened the door and entered, everyone's eyes lit up. What a beautiful girl. Medisha was a pure-blooded silver elf royalty, and her beauty was self-evident. Although her body hadn't fully matured, and she had a delicate temperament, she attracted the attention of others. Roman and Scarlet were not to be outdone either. The merchant girl always had a unique temperament that made people want to take a second look at her, and her pair of dark eyes played an important role. Moreover, her hands were placed on the leather bag in front of her chest, and the way she looked around made people have a good impression of her. Scarlet's amber eyes were like burning flames that attracted people's attention. When the girl entered the bar, she couldn't help but frown slightly. The tip of her eyebrows raised, and there was a dangerous aura about her that kept people away. The lightning spear was disassembled into 3 parts and tied to her back. The girl raised her head slightly, letting her long red ponytail hang behind her back. She looked around with a vigilant expression. However, the one who caused a commotion among the guests was Yuta, who didn't stand out as much in terms of appearance. The female mercenary group leader's tall and voluptuous figure caused everyone to subconsciously whistle when she entered the hall. A few gazes even landed on the group leader's towering chest. Yuta didn't mind and only snorted coldly. Brando couldn't help but chuckle. He had often seen such a scene in fantastical stories. It could even be said that the various inns were one of the most important places in such stories. Adventurers discussed their plans in low voices, rude guests played drinking games, and the sound of flirting with the barmaids could be heard. It would be perfect if there was a poet. With such unrealistic thoughts in mind, Brando turned around. The owner of the bar was already waiting for him. He was just an ordinary middle-aged man, but from the looks of it, he could already see the hierarchy of the group. When the men, whose lower body dictated their thoughts, looked at the women, the middle-aged man paid more attention to the details of the temperament that exuded from Brando's group. Although the two angelic attendants behind the young men had picturesque features, the middle-aged man's gaze didn't linger on them for long. As the owner of this crowded bar, he had long been trained to see people differently from the average person. Especially the confidence of a modern person in Brando. He was very similar to the descendants of nobles who were born in prominent families and had received good education since young. Therefore, the middle-aged man could tell the young man apart from the others at a glance. This is a noble young master, the owner of the bar thought. He forced a smile on his face and unconsciously spoke in a more respectful tone. Is there anything I can help you with? Brando looked up and saw a wooden board with the types of wine for sale hanging in front of the wine rack. He pointed at the most expensive wine on the board and ordered a glass. Of course, Brando wasn't interested in the wine. He was just putting on an act. Other than Medisha, the other ladies ordered a fruit wine that was slightly sweet and slightly sour. Spirits didn't need to eat, so the Silver Fairy Princess just stood quietly behind them. Scarlet noticed her and whispered, "Can't you eat?" Medisha was taken aback and shook her head. "It's just not necessary." "Then let's try it." The girl fiddled with her long ponytail. "If we don't order anything here, we'll be too conspicuous." "No," Roman's voice cut in and said seriously, "a real lady won't eat anything in a messy place like this." Scarlet saw the merchant girl holding a glass of fruit wine with both hands and rolled her eyes. "Aren't you drinking too?" she asked in annoyance. "I'm not a lady to begin with." Roman widened her eyes and answered matter-of-factly. When Medisa heard the conversation between the two, she could only chuckle to herself. As for the two angelic attendants, they ignored the chatter of the girls and followed behind Brando expressionlessly. This allowed the middle-aged man to confirm who was the female companion and who was the attendant. He looked at the few of them and asked with the keen eyes of a businessman, "Are you from the outside?" Scarlet stopped and raised her eyebrows alertly. Brando knew that there was nothing to hide. Although these people were not local, they had seen a lot of people in the town. They might know all the locals in the town, so deliberately hiding it would only make them suspicious. He simply nodded. "Let's try our luck." Brando didn't tell the truth. The middle-aged man thought that they might be the children of a noble who left home to play. This kind of person was not uncommon in Erewhon, but they were usually the descendants of nobles with a certain amount of family background. "So you're going into the forest, do you need a guide?" He thought for a moment and asked. "The service is very good." Brando thought that the glass of the most expensive wine in his hand was effective. A place like this was a place where information was circulated, and the owner often sold information on the side. However, most of the information was based on hearsay, and there was no way to determine whether it was true or false. The only good thing was that the price was also included in the cost of the wine. "I won't charge you an extra cent." Brando ordered the most expensive wine in the restaurant, and the middle-aged man was naturally very attentive. However, Brando still shook his head. "I don't need a guide, but I want to ask, what's the situation in the forest?" "The town's surroundings are not dangerous, but you will encounter wild beasts and possibly monsters if you go deep into the forest," the middle-aged man replied. "Also, there's a mining area to the north. If you go that way, you might encounter patrols from the mining area. It won't be good if you're caught as someone with bad intentions." As if afraid that the young man would not know the immensity of heaven and earth, he hurriedly added, "Although this is Tanajel's territory, the owner of the mining area is actually Count Randner." "Oh," Brendel said. He lowered his head and took a sip of the wine. The spicy taste went straight from his tongue to his throat, and then back into his nose. The young man almost coughed violently. Brando frowned. He was not a good drinker, and it was not a wise choice to pretend to be like this. With great difficulty he suppressed the taste in his mouth. He had already made up his mind not to touch this thing in the slightest. At the same time, he raised his head and asked in a roundabout manner, Since that's the case, what places should I avoid? Don't go north, the innkeeper replied. As long as you don't go north, there won't be any trouble. But if I don't go north, how will I find the legendary open-air silver mine? Brando purposely frowned. The middle-aged man glanced at him and thought, as expected, he's here for this. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation, P.S. Recently there have been doomsday cult followers roaming the book review section again. Chapter 281. That's hard to say, the innkeeper lowered his body and whispered to them, but if you don't lack money you can try looking for a few famous adventurers. Those adventurers have been to the forest many times and have even drawn a map of the area. A map? It's worth a lot. Brando nodded and asked about the local situation. It was mainly about the work and rest of the workers, as well as the patrol time of the soldiers in the mining area. Of course he was pretending to be an adventurer. As for the owner of the inn, he saw him as a noble who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth and only wanted to have fun. Both of them did not mind the misunderstanding, and the conversation went on harmoniously. Brando did not waste much of his time. After a short while, he turned around and saw that the ladies had found a seat in the hall. Brando looked at them and was about to walk over, but he stopped. A dwarf stood in front of him. Please make way. The drunk Odom squinted his small eyes and could barely see the young man in front of him. He thought that it was the one who came in earlier, but that was not important. He just wanted to know, what was the purpose of this person blocking his way? The old dwarf shook his head and wanted to figure it out. But Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. It was as if the road was 10 feet wide, but the damn dwarf insisted on standing in front of him and saying that he was blocking his way. But he did not have the time to cause trouble here, so he hesitated for a while and stepped aside. But at this moment Brando was stunned. The dwarf's face was red, and Brando thought that he was just a common hill dwarf. But after looking at him for a while, Brando noticed that the dwarf's skin was light gray. The young man's heart thumped heavily. A rune dwarf. He almost thought that he was still asleep and wanted to pinch his cheeks to confirm whether he was drunk or the dwarf was drunk. The rune dwarves were not as prominent as the silver elves in Wone's history. They came from the underground of Jorgindi Ridge just like the cavemen. But they were different from the ordinary people of the underground. They were the silver folk that had disappeared long ago. Legend has it that the rune dwarves were wiped out in the war before the end of the Age of Chaos. Another legend said that the rune dwarves had a city on the other side of the Mercury Sea. But no matter which one it was, Brando did not expect to see a living rune dwarf here. That's right, their light gray skin was their most prominent feature. Other than that, there were no other dwarves in the world with such skin color. These dwarves from the Silver Age were the builders of the Steel Plains. Their architectural skills were on par with the craftsmen of Buga during the Age of Chaos. However, the rune dwarves were not satisfied with this evaluation. It was just that one of their creations was on the ground while the other was in the sky. They had never had the chance to compete. But Brando calmed down after a short moment of shock. Brando knew that no matter what the characteristics were, there would always be some adventurous and wandering tribes. However, most of these descendants had more or less inherited the similarities in their bloodline. As for how much of their cultural heritage was left, only the heavens knew. There were actually quite a number of ancient descendants in Vaunt, but many of them did not even know their own origins. For example, if Brando had not seen the description of the rune dwarf, he would not have recognized the drunken dwarf. But just as he was thinking about it, Odom had already shakily brushed past him. Brendel turned around and saw the old dwarf parting the crowd and walking away, leaving only his back view. Brando thought for a while and did not immediately follow him. There was nothing to talk about with a drunken dwarf. Moreover, the dwarf seemed to be a worker here, so he would not disappear from the face of the earth anytime soon. His goal was to take control of the silver mine, and it would be much better to interact with the dwarf then. But even so, he still turned around and asked the middle-aged man. Who is that? An old man, I think his name is Odom. He's been here for a while now. The middle-aged man did not know why the young noble was interested in the unkempt dwarf. He's a miner in the mine. What does he do? Overseer. Have you heard of his specialty? For example, construction? Brando asked further. The middle-aged man was stunned and shook his head. I have not heard of him. Oh, I thought the dwarves were all experts in construction. Brando laughed and purposely said so. That must be the mountain dwarves from the north, my guest. Brando nodded and put the matter aside. He then turned around and walked back to the table where the ladies were. When he approached, the Roman and Medisha were chatting about something, but they stopped at the same time and looked at the young lord. What's wrong? Yuta asked. Nothing, Brando shook his head, but I have asked around and the situation is not good. What happened? Yuta's eyes flashed with a hint of worry. Other than Brando, she was the only one who cared about the success or failure of this matter. We thought that the workers would go in and out of the mine every day, but I just heard that is not the case, Brando said in a low voice. In fact, the workers are only in town for 1 day a week. Every Monday morning they will return to the mine and will only leave after Saturday. The other party is very strict with the management of the workers. Yes, the chances of us fishing in troubled waters is small, Brando said. What's the problem? Scarlet asked, puzzled. 2 points. It is not difficult to take control of the mine. We just need to kill the intermediate gold-ranked swordsman. The remaining 100 or so people will not be enough. However, it is a little troublesome to do it quietly and not attract the attention of Lord Paulus. But me, my lord, and Princess Medicia, will there be any problem for the three of us to deal with the intermediate gold-ranked swordsman? The red-haired girl frowned and asked. Of course not, but you should know how big the commotion caused by a fight between gold-ranked swordsmen is. Brando replied. As long as one person knows that the mine is under attack, the news will spread like wildfire. In a few days, Lord Paulus will know more about this matter than we do. We can seal the news. Roman suggested. Lord Paulus is not a fool. If there is no news from Shaftalin for a long time, he will be suspicious. The only thing we can do is to control this place and make it work as usual, and secretly send silver to Ferber. Brendel shook his head. Brando did not finish his sentence, but everyone knew what was going to happen next. The silver would be secretly sent to the mint and made into private coins. This was a secret that the local lords did not need to disclose. In fact, before they left, Brando had already asked the county to search for a secret mint that Grodin might be hiding in a manor outside Abbey's. In fact, these were all things that could lead to the gallows, but as Brando often said, a death row criminal would not care if there was 1 or 2 nooses around his neck. Scarlet was startled for a moment, then slowly nodded in understanding. Can't we lure him out? Or take action when he is outside? That human can't stay in the mine forever, right? The Silver Fairy Princess suggested in a soft voice. We can, but if he doesn't come out once a month, won't we have to wait here for a month? Brando shook his head. That's why we have to take the initiative and sneak into the mine to find out his movements. Besides, if we want to control the mine, our men will have to infiltrate it sooner or later. Medicia nodded in agreement. Then what should we do, my lord? Yuta asked softly. Shoot, don't call me my lord here, Brando looked around and said, actually I've not only heard bad news but also 2 good news. This time, no one interrupted as if they were waiting for him to continue. The first news is that the adventurers in the vicinity might have secretly made a map of the mine. I think this news is very likely to be true. From what I know, adventurers often do this kind of thing. Yes, young master, the mercenary leader saw Brando's gaze and hurriedly corrected herself. Sometimes the adventurers would even work together with the local bandits. The nobles usually turn a blind eye to this kind of thing since they won't do anything anyway. And the second news? Romaine asked curiously. I heard that the adventurers here would occasionally work in the mines for a period of time. You should know that adventurers don't always have the means to support themselves. Yuta was startled when she heard the news. The nobles are willing to let these troublemakers into the mines? Why wouldn't they? The mines need labor. They're not allowed to bring weapons into the mines, and they're not allowed to leave with even a piece of ore. The mines are used to exchange ores for money and food. What can these adventurers do? Besides, this is Count Randner's territory. Other than us, who else would cause trouble? Brando asked in a low voice. Then can't we sneak in? Romaine's eyes lit up. You can't, but I can. There are others who can too, Brando shook his head. The mines don't take in women or else the world will be in chaos. They looked at each other and saw the feasibility of the plan in each other's eyes. If they could sneak into the mines as workers, then it would be easy to find out the movements of the guards. But how should they do it? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 282. The entrance to the mine was bustling with activity. Be it workers or adventurers, all of them entered the mine in an orderly manner under the watchful eyes of a group of cavalrymen. In order to speed up the process, the crowd formed 3 columns. Brando glanced at the map in his hand and silently memorized the terrain and markings on it. He then folded the parchment and kept it in his bosom. He raised his head and looked at the group in front of him. More than 20 mercenaries had successfully infiltrated the mine, and the cavalrymen patrolling the entrance were not very vigilant. This was probably because Schaflund had been peaceful for too long. Even if there were bandits harassing Tonagel, these outlaws rarely dared to enter the mine. On one hand, they were afraid of Count Randner's reputation, and on the other hand, the losses outweighed the gains. Brando's gaze landed on the lush forest. Scarlet, Medisha, and Yuta might have already infiltrated the mine. Even the weakest of them was at least a silver-ranked warrior, and it would not be difficult for them to avoid the attention of the soldiers on the tower. The Roman was left behind in Schaflund, and there were 2 holy angels protecting him. At the very least he would not be too worried. Then Brando heard the cavalryman in front of him shouting, "Next!" The cavalryman's voice carried a strong local accent, and he knew it was his turn. They hurriedly lowered their heads and walked forward. At first, they thought that the other party would at least make a show of searching them, but they didn't expect that the cavalrymen wearing bright silver-pointed helmets would let them pass after sweeping their gaze over their heads and seeing that no one was carrying any weapons. If I knew this would happen, maybe Yuta and the others could have disguised themselves as men and sneaked in. Brando shook his head and thought to himself. But it seems like the silver-ranked swordsman's vigilance is not that high. This is good news. After passing the sentry post, the surveillance became more relaxed. Brando looked around and quickly identified the mercenaries in disguise. Of course, the so-called disguise meant that they did not bring any weapons. Of course, he did not immediately rush forward to meet up with his men. Although it wasn't that adventurers didn't travel in groups, their group of more than 20 people was enough to arouse suspicion. Moreover, everyone had left a way to contact each other, so there was no rush. Brando had completed all sorts of quests in the Amber Sword, but he had never gone deep into enemy territory in disguise. For a moment he couldn't help but feel a little nervous and inexplicably excited. But when he remembered that he was a gold-ranked level 1 player, he subconsciously calmed down a little. Yes, although in the past game, it was a wound where gold was as plentiful as dogs and elements were everywhere. But now, it was only the end of the year of flowers and summer leaves. The War of the Black Roses, which had begun and ended in a hurry this year, had just ignited the flames of war on the land. In this year, there were probably only a few who had the strength of a gold ranker before the age of 20. Brando looked to the side, silently observing the surrounding terrain, as if he was admiring the scenery. Between Schaflund and the mines, there was only a narrow, winding path through the forest. Occasionally one could see the rolling hills of Greyhill Hill towards Trentheim, beyond the trees halfway up the hill. It was as if a watercolor had been drawn out on a green canvas, and the trees were like mottled ink dots sprinkled over the mountain range. It was very pleasing to the eye. He raised his hand again and looked at the unfamiliar patterns growing on his palm. For a moment he couldn't help but feel a little absent-minded. It seemed like a long journey, but in retrospect, it had only been a few months. It was as if it was yesterday, and he remembered that he was still a penniless guy. But in these few short months he had companions, power that he could rely on, subordinates, and even his own territory. Everything was just like everything he believed in. Step by step he controlled the foreseeable future. Until he changed the unknown fate between this ancient kingdom and himself. But now the ship had begun to turn around. It seemed like it was no longer sailing into the darkness, but there was a glimmer of light. How nice would it be if Senior knew all of this? Brando laughed in his heart. But a unique scenery that flashed past interrupted his thoughts. Brando noticed that it was a corner of a sentry tower that peeked out from the dense canopy of trees. He saw soldiers with pointed helmets on duty. Looking further away, there were sentry towers like this on every hill. Compared to the relaxed attitude of the cavalry outside, the defensive arrangements here can be said to be tight. Brando thought. At the same time he compared the locations of the sentry towers with the map, and he knew that the adventurers did not lie to him. The map cost him 3,000 tor, but it seemed like it was worth the price. Brando looked into the distance without saying a word, and he tried to reconstruct the surrounding terrain in his mind. But just as he was concentrating, he suddenly felt someone bumping into him from behind. He turned around and saw a young man passing by him. The young man probably did not expect to bump into someone. Or rather, he thought that Brando was just a young man who was not much older than him, but he felt like he bumped into a mountain. The huge recoil almost made him fall to the side. The young man took a few steps forward before he could steady himself. He held his chest and gasped for breath. He was obviously shocked, but he quickly raised his head and looked at Brando with surprise. But his surprise quickly turned into an apologetic look. "I'm sorry." The young man suddenly realized his mistake and apologized with embarrassment. Brendel looked at the boy. He was wearing a set of adventurer's clothing. It was made from leather and did not have any other advantages. The only good thing about it was that it was durable, but it was barely acceptable to look at. Since you said you're sorry, give me back my things. Brando paused for a moment and replied. He had seen a lot of these pickpockets in the Amber Sword. Even if he did not have this ability in the game, he could still catch the young man. Now he was a real gold-tier swordsman. Now that he had the body of a gold-tier swordsman, it was much easier to use it than in the game with the help of the system. As soon as Brando said that, the apologetic look on the young man's face turned into one of surprise, but he immediately laughed. You found out? That's amazing. The young man smiled, revealing his white teeth. Even though he was exposed, he did not quibble. Instead, he generously took out a pouch from under his clothes. It was Brando's money pouch. It's okay. Brando took the pouch and replied, next time remember to be gentle. Also, he solemnly added, pick a target. The young man nodded, but he was a little curious. You're an adventurer? I don't think so. You're not from here, right? But I see that you seem to know the rules here very well. He shook his head again. But I agree with what you said about picking a fat target. But this time, we didn't expect you to be so strong at such a young age. I feel that your reaction is much faster than Mars. That guy always likes to brag. By the way, brother, where are you from? Brando did not know who Mar was, nor was he interested in knowing. He was not used to the young man's familiarity. He thought for a moment and replied, I've been to many places. In fact, the rules of the Thieves' Guild are the same everywhere. But since you've returned the money, I don't want to make a big deal out of it. No one wants to offend a bunch of people for no reason. What he said was all based on his experience. In today's vaunt, an experienced adventurer would probably be able to say the same thing, but coming from a young man's mouth, it seemed a little demonic. Besides, people like you are very difficult to deal with. Brando concluded. The young man did not mind. In fact, he was happy as if Brando was praising him. After hearing Brando's words, he showed a curious expression. You said you've been to many places. That's impossible. You're so young. Brando shook his head and smiled. But it was because of this that the young man showed interest. He followed Brando and said, I'm Joka. What about you? Brando did not reply to his question, but the young man did not seem to mind. He put his hands behind his head and asked with interest, Are you telling the truth? You said we're like a thieves' guild. What's a thieves' guild like? Brendel glanced at him and replied, What they did is similar to what you did. The young man raised an eyebrow. I heard there's going to be a war soon. Is that true? Brendel felt a little depressed. Do you really think I'm a jack of all trades? He thought for a moment and replied, You're from here? Why are you so interested in the outside world? He could tell from the young man's accent that he was a local. But this time, the young man smiled mysteriously and replied, Nothing. I just wanted to ask. Then I won't disturb you anymore. Let's talk when we have time. With these words, he fell a step behind, then turned around and disappeared into the crowd. But Brendel's eyes were sharp, and he saw the boy running into the crowd and gathering with another group of people who were about the same age as him. He thought for a moment and decided to listen to what they were talking about. I failed. That guy is very strong. The young man who spoke first said. How strong can a guy that young be? I can even steal a few coins from the adventurers in town. Don't tell me you're too incompetent, Joka. Another voice chuckled and mocked. You can try more. The young man retorted. If you don't ask for support, it looks like no one will support you. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 283. Why don't you try Mar? The youth retorted. Tisk, he's already on his guard. You've got it all planned out, but he's pretty good. He's been to a lot of places. Joka said, even though he's not a local, he seems to know our rules. I'm surprised. A weak voice spoke up. Mar got the story from a drunkard. He's just copying the rules. It'd be weird if he didn't know. Mar's face reddened. Cut the crap. Isn't that guy very knowledgeable? Why don't you sell those weird things to him? Maybe he'll like them. Even though he said sell, his tone sounded like he was mocking Mar. I can't be bothered to deal with a vulgar person like you. You don't know what's good for you. That's enough. I told you not to cause trouble, a fourth voice spoke up. It was a girl's voice. Brando froze. A woman really came in disguise? He couldn't help but curse at the riders outside before he continued to listen. We met that man at the trout in the forest yesterday. He was with a few women and he didn't look like an adventurer. The girl's voice continued. I saw him ordering the most expensive wine at Old John's. He didn't look like he was short of money. He must be up to no good here. Brando frowned and cursed his bad luck. He decided to disguise himself and sneak into the mines after he heard the news, but he forgot that he had already exposed himself. However, with such a small mistake, he thought that it was impossible for someone to be caught so coincidentally. But he didn't expect Mother Marcia to play such a big joke on him. The scene yesterday afternoon was actually noticed by someone. While he was thinking about how to deal with this, the girl continued, Should we report this? Brando's heart skipped a beat. But the weak voice spoke up, Don't say anything. This has nothing to do with us. Just pretend that you don't know about this. This isn't a simple matter. You might have an accomplice. None of us want to lose our heads, right? After this voice, the others were silent for a while. All right. Mar replied, It's decided then. After this we'll be leaving this place. Let's not cause any more trouble. Everyone nodded in agreement. Brando turned around. He didn't think that someone in the group would say something so insightful. He couldn't help but be interested in the person who spoke. But when he turned around, the youths were long gone. Interesting. Brendel had a strange thought in his mind. Brando didn't walk for long on the 2-mile road to the mine. But when he entered the mine, he could feel that the surveillance around him had become stricter. Schaflun's silver mine was located in the middle of a mountain range. Because of the shallow mining, the surrounding mountain walls had been hollowed out, forming a concave valley. If one looked from the mouth of the valley, they would see large patches of gray and lead-black rocks. Brando didn't recognize the silver ore, but he could recognize the watchtowers that were built on top of the mountains. He couldn't help but frown when he looked at them. It was very troublesome to get in and out of this place. He wanted to lure the gold-ranked swordsman out to kill him, but it didn't seem feasible now. He had to change his plan at the last minute. He looked around. The ground in the concave valley was relatively flat, but he couldn't see the entrance to the mine from here. Instead, he could see that there was a semi-fortress outside the valley. That should be the barracks of the local garrison. Count Randner's secretary and adjutant should be there as well. Brendel turned around and looked at the piles of slag in the valley. There were mining carts everywhere and workers were coming and going. Most of them were orderly, and only a few adventurers like him who came here for the first time were at a loss. But he wasn't nervous. He calmed down and followed behind the others. The soldiers wouldn't leave them alone, and he thought that someone would come and line them up soon. And it turned out that he was right. Brando soon saw a group of patrolling cavalrymen appearing from the side of the valley. They rode their mounts closer to the group of adventurers, but the cavalrymen who were wearing bright noble uniforms didn't seem to have the mood to waste time on them. Instead, they shouted at the group of adventurers, "Line up over there and get your number and tools." With that, the cavalrymen immediately turned around and walked towards the group of adventurers. Brando looked at the direction the cavalrymen pointed at. There, the manager of the mine was handing out tools and a wooden plate with a number written on it to the workers. Both of these items were not allowed to be lost or damaged in the mining area. If any of these were to happen, they would be severely punished. The Wond of this era did not have any humanitarianism. Here, as long as there was a legitimate or not legitimate reason, it was not a big deal to be beaten to death. Even the secretary of the mine had the right to order a person to be hanged as long as he suspected that someone had stolen the count's ores. But Brando didn't care about that. He was only concerned about which camp he would be assigned to. The workers naturally lived in the valley for the next 6 days. Thus, no matter how stingy the mine officials were, they had no choice but to build a crude camp for the workers. Naturally, the main building of the camp was a thatched hut. It was filled with all sorts of unbearable smells for a modern person. If not for the fact that Brando's body was much stronger than that of an ordinary person after entering the Golden Realm, he was worried that he would faint from the stench when he entered the dimly lit hut. His worry quickly became a reality. He frowned as he stood in front of the crumbling hut. He compared the number in his hand with the location of the hut. But in the end he was disappointed. It was here. Brando's nose twitched. He was still a few feet away from the hut, but he could already smell the nauseating stench. At that moment, he suddenly felt that Yuta, Scarlet, and Medisha were wise not to come. And of course he had made the most foolish choice. He hesitated for a moment and could not help but look back. There were a total of 4 such camps in the valley. He had secretly noticed that most of the mercenaries were scattered. But he believed that this would not be a problem for the experienced warriors. Another piece of good news was that there were 3 people who were assigned to the same camp as him. He had already found some markings outside the huts. But no matter if it was good news or bad news, it could not solve the current problem. Brando frowned in distress. In the end, he hesitated and walked towards the dark hut. His expression was as if he was walking towards the execution ground. Of course, before entering the hut, he waved his hand and an invisible wind rolled up a few pebbles and formed a triangle at the door. After he had mastered the White Raven swordsmanship, he could now use it freely. Brando thought that this would be a very useful swordsmanship. If he had the time, he could go to Erwin's palace and learn the advanced parts of it. But this idea was a little unrealistic. After all, Erwin's secret swordsmanship was not something that could be easily leaked out. Princess Griffin must be proficient in this swordsmanship as well. But what conditions would she be willing to teach it to him was a problem. With this thought in mind, he entered the hut. Even though he tried his best to control himself, he could not help but cover his nose with his hand. The hut was quiet for a moment. Then he heard a voice that was almost inaudible. "Tisk, spoiled nobleman." This sentence was almost silent. If it was heard by a normal person, it would have been inaudible. But Brando heard it clearly. He raised his head and saw the people in the hut. Then he was stunned. This was too much of a coincidence. The people in the hut were none other than the youths he met before. He first saw the youth named Joka. He was smiling awkwardly as he sat on a straw mat opposite him. Then there was the youth named Mar beside him. He seemed to be the oldest among them and also the most muscular one. He was taller than Joka by a head and was almost the same height as Brando. Brando immediately knew that this youth was the one who spoke earlier. He saw the youth's hand under his clothes and guessed that there was a dagger or short sword under his clothes. Brando could not help but curse at the patrolling knights outside. "You have some guts, but you don't know what's good for you." That was his first impression of the youth. Then he looked to the other side. Sitting on the straw mat was a youth who seemed to be stunted. Because of his thin limbs, his head seemed to be bigger than a normal person's. But the youth's gaze surprised Brando. It was neither Joka's nor Mar's alertness. It was a look of observation. He was observing him. Brando's interest was piqued. He knew that he was different from a few months ago. He had experienced battles, killed people, and became the leader of thousands of people. He even had the strength of a gold-ranked warrior. Even though he was trying to hide his identity, Brando knew that some things could not be hidden. For example, his gaze and temperament. In fact, there were very few people who could look him in the eye, but this youth was able to calmly observe him. Brando also observed the youth carefully. He noticed that there was a gray backpack beside the youth's straw mat, but he did not know what was inside. Finally, he looked up and saw the girl who was dressed as a boy. She was also a little skinny and did not look very pretty. She was just a little delicate with a few freckles on her face. Even though the room was dark, it was as bright as day in his eyes, and he could see everything clearly. Other than these few people, there were actually 3 other youths in the room. They seemed to be in the same group. But that was not what Brando wanted to complain about. What he really wanted to complain about was 8 people in such a small room. Oh my God, Martha. Even the third-rate university I went to wasn't this stingy. What a bunch of bastards. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 284. After Brando arrived, the room became silent. However, Brando did not care. He walked into the shed and sat down on the only empty straw mat. Everyone's eyes followed his movements and focused on him, especially the boy named Mar. He was almost frowning as he stared at him without moving an inch. Brando could not help but shake his head. Was he that scary? He did not do anything on the surface, but as a gold ranker, he knew everyone's movements like the back of his hand. Their tense muscles and heavy heartbeats proved that they were very nervous. However, he did not try to dispel their nervousness. He thought that it was better this way. Although these guys would not reveal his secret for the time being, who would know? It would be good if he could monitor their every move. Because of his presence, the strange and tense atmosphere in the room lasted until the evening. To be exact, it was after dinner. Most of the workers arrived at the mine on Sunday night. The silver mine usually started work the next morning. Brando had a lot of time to familiarize himself with the situation here. However, he did not try the terrible dinner. He could not tell what was cooking in the pot. It was green and sticky like a witch's potion. It even had a rancid smell. Just one look was enough to make him lose his appetite, let alone eat it. He was only glad that he had brought enough food with him under Jana's reminder. At the same time, he suspected that the female mercenary leader had done similar work before. Otherwise, how could she be so experienced? After walking around outside and confirming the location of the other camps, Brando returned to his shed. But this time, as soon as he entered the house, he saw the malnourished boy sitting in the room. He did not seem to have gone out with the others. Brando looked to the side and found that the girl was accompanying the young man. He was stunned. "You don't eat?" Brando thought that the young man was being ostracized by the others. After all, this kind of thing often happened in such groups. It was not rare. However, the young man shook his head. "I don't eat dinner." The young man did not seem to be afraid of him. He answered calmly. "Not eating dinner?" Brando was stunned. "Fasting?" He immediately thought that this was a follower of the Silver Lily sect. In his impression, only those poor ascetics would have such a strange habit. The monks of the Silver Lily did not have dinner because they wanted to remember the days when Herod, the Flame King, was on the Great Plains. It was the most difficult period of the human race in the Dark Ages. They wandered the wilderness to escape the pursuit of the Myurnas. Countless people died of starvation on this road. The boy nodded at Brando's question. The Silver Lily sect was a small sect under the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It was very common in the Iraq region, but most of the followers of this sect did not practice fasting, unless they were apprentices who had been taught. So Brando looked at the young man and asked, "Have you studied under a cultivator before?" The youth nodded again. "I studied with a cultivator for a period of time. Although I didn't enter the sect, I still received his teachings." "Monsieur," he answered politely. "You can read?" Brando asked. The young man nodded. This was incredible. Freya only knew a few words when she was the captain of Butchie's militia. This was because she was lucky enough to meet Martin, who was the captain of Butchie's garrison. Martin was very famous in the game. In fact, he was different from the ordinary Erewhon soldiers because he was not only literate but also very knowledgeable. From this point of view, Brando's grandfather was also the same. However, Brando knew that his ancestors were at least rich. His father was a miller, so it was normal for the family to have passed down education. The Roman was only literate because of his aunt. It was a joke that the descendants of witches could not read. As for the rest of the people, most of them were illiterate. In this world there were not many people who could read. Brando sat down and asked with interest, "If that's the case, why are you still here?" Although the Church of the Silver Lily is poor, it is still an official sect recognized by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. "Monsieur, I don't know which sect I belong to. The cultivator who taught me has already passed away." The young man replied. Brando suddenly understood. So that was the case. The young man probably did not receive any formal teachings, so he could only be considered as an ordinary believer. His interest in this small episode only lasted for a moment. His mind quickly returned to the operation. After the previous investigation, Brando had a preliminary understanding of the general situation in the mine. However, this made him feel more and more troubled. As far as he knew, the swordsman who was their biggest threat in this operation rarely appeared in the mine. Most of the time he would stay in the barracks. Of course, it was impossible for them to sneak into the barracks and kill him. It was easy to sneak in, but to kill him and not be discovered was a bit of a fantasy. Brando could not think of a comprehensive plan at the moment. Fortunately, he had made up his mind to stay here for a week. He could only wait and see if he could find an opportunity during this week. However, as he was thinking about this, he heard the young man coughing. He turned around and saw that the young man was coughing badly with the help of the young woman. The young man probably noticed his gaze and looked up apologetically. He smiled and replied, "It's an old illness, monsieur. If you feel uncomfortable, you can sit further away." Brando did not mind. His constitution was now close to 100. Although he was not immune to all diseases, at least traditional diseases could not affect him. He shook his head and took out a water bag from his backpack. "There is clean water in here." He knew that the water in the mine was not for humans to drink. Some of the water in the wooden bucket had already become smelly. "Thank you." The young woman with faint freckles took the water bag from the young man's hand. Then she looked at Brando strangely. Brando was puzzled by her look. He did not think too much when he passed the water bag to her. It was just a bag of water. As a modern person who once lived in an era of abundance, Brando obviously did not care about this little thing. But he didn't realize that in a world like Vaunt, most people living at the bottom of society still believed in the law of the jungle where the strong preyed on the weak. Here, not everyone was willing to lend a helping hand to the weak for free. In any case, Brando's unintentional action had won him a good impression of the young man. After drinking a mouthful of water, the young man's coughing became more relaxed. However, he did not have the strength to speak. After a moment of silence, the young woman spoke first. "Monsieur, I heard that you are very powerful?" Brendel was taken aback for a moment, thinking that this question was rather strange, and he had never considered this question before. Was he considered to be powerful? He compared it to his experience in the past when he was level 130 and shook his head. Just barely is very powerful. I heard that the adventurers outside have a rank called Iron or something. I presume that Monsieur is one of them? The young woman asked. It's the Iron rank, the young man added. Brando looked at the two of them. He did not understand why they were interested in this. However, the division of professions was not a secret. In fact, many civilians knew about it. Barely enough, just a little bit more. Brando thought that it was already very eye-catching for someone as young as him to have the strength of an Iron rank. Most of the mercenaries under him were at least in their 30s or 40s when they entered the Iron rank. However, it was better for him to be as inconspicuous as possible. So he answered casually. He saw the two of them look at each other. Then the young woman asked again, "Monsieur, are all adventurers like you? I'm talking about Black Iron rank?" Brando looked at them. Of course not. As you know, those who have the strength of an Iron rank are considered very strong among adventurers. He was not lying. Who would become an adventurer if they were stronger? Unless they were the kind of people who liked to wander around, but those people were not the majority. But after answering, he added, "Why are you asking this? We want to go outside and take a look." This time the young man spoke. "Go on an adventure?" The young man nodded. Brando thought that being an adventurer was not a good choice, but he did not dissuade him. In fact, to a certain extent, being a miner here was not much better. He was also a young man, so he naturally understood the young man's thoughts. But when he looked at the young man, he suddenly remembered that the young man knew more about the mine than he did. And the young man in front of him seemed to have let down some of his guard against him. Wasn't this a good opportunity to ask for information? So he thought for a moment and asked, "I heard that some of the tunnels in Schaflund's silver mine are connected to the underground world of Jorgendi Ridge. Is that right?" "Sir, I don't know what you mean by Jorgendi Ridge." The young man shook his head. "But there are some tunnels that lead to the underground world. Legend has it that no one has ever reached the end of the tunnel. Some people have even gone missing because of it." Brando thought that Tajiv's information was indeed correct. He suddenly had a vague idea in his mind. "That sounds interesting. Are there any legends related to it?" The young man exchanged glances with the girl beside him, but this small movement did not escape Brando's eyes. In fact, they already knew that Brando came here with ulterior motives, and now it seemed that he came for the strange legends in the mines. This was indeed fitting of an adventurer. "Of course." The young man nodded slowly. "Do you want to hear it, sir?" "Of course." Brando replied, "If you tell me the details, I can give you a reward." He probably sensed that the other party had misunderstood and was happy to keep the misunderstanding going. "P.S. I forgot the time when I was drawing today, so I uploaded a hand-drawn drawing of Freya to the public. If you like it, you can go and take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 285. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Early morning on Mount Greyhar was lit by a faint line of light purple and blue in the sky. As the stars gradually faded into the white, the forest on the top of the mountain formed a unique silhouette under the faint light. But it was even earlier in the mining area. The sky was still dark, but the sound of wooden whistles could be heard. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast a deep shadow on the ground. Brando was called out of the camp like the others. Before dawn, the air in the forest was a little chilly. He looked at the thing in his hand, not knowing what to do. It was a pickaxe. Its rough wooden handle was nearly 4 feet long. Probably because it had been used by many owners, its surface had been polished smooth. There was not a single protruding burr, and the dark gray tip of the pickaxe was a little blunt. But that was not the point. What made him sigh was that he never thought that he would be a miner again. Most people who had experienced the prehistoric era of online games would often have a sense of familiarity with mining in the muddled memories of that era. Brando was no exception. He had also been a miner in the game for a long time. He had worked day and night in the dark mines, mining, selecting ores, and then selling the high-quality ores on the market. It was boring to think about now, but at that time, it was a source of endless fun and motivation. Because he watched the money he earned to equip his character step by step and become stronger, he was filled with a sense of spiritual satisfaction. Although this was just an achievement in the virtual world. Brando weighed the pickaxe and could not help but laugh at himself for a moment. But he looked up and carefully identified the figures in the crowd in the distance. He quickly found the presence of Yuta, Scarlet, and Medisha among a few familiar figures. They had obviously seen the marks he left in the forest at night and had now disguised themselves as miners and blended in with the workers. They wore headscarves, which was not uncommon among the mountain villagers, but their dirty clothes were bought by Brando from the teenagers. They had a lot of connections in the area, so it was very convenient for him. However, the biggest reward he got was the information he got from Cohen. It was the rumor that the Shaflan mine was connected to the underground world. When he heard Cohen's words, he had a vague idea in his mind, and after some time he finally connected this idea to his plan. As for whether his plan would succeed or not, it would depend on the situation today. Even Brando did not expect the opportunity to come so quickly. While he was thinking about it, he felt someone elbow him from behind. He turned around and saw Joka. It turned out that Joka saw him in a daze and came over to remind him. "Be careful. Once you get the tools, you'll be whipped if you're late," Joka whispered as he walked past him. The first thing he did was to check if his money pouch was still on him. When he turned around, he saw the frail youth nodding at him from afar. It was obvious that the youth had sent Joka over to remind him. After spending a short time with him yesterday, the teenagers were not as wary of him as before, but Cohen was willing to help him out of gratitude. Brando felt that Cohen did not want to owe him a favor or have anything to do with him. This was within his expectations, but he did not expect Cohen to have such a high status in the group. He thought for a moment and quickly caught up with Joka. "Where should I go?" Joka already knew that Brando was only here as a pretense, so he was not surprised by his question. "Since you don't know, just follow us. I know where there are more mines." "Thank you." "This isn't a free service." Joka turned around and rubbed his fingers together. "You have money, right?" "Of course." Brando smiled. After the two of them entered the mine, the light naturally became soft and dim. After the silver mines in Shafland were cleared out, the humans drilled several deep wells into the ground to mine the lower layers of the silver mines. The mine was crisscrossed under the Graha rock formation, but only oil lamps at great distances from each other outlined the meandering with the division of light and shadow. But Brando and Joka were not the only ones who went deep into the mine. The workers entered from several main entrances and quickly dispersed. He looked around, and when he saw Jana, Medisa, and Scarlet quietly blending into the crowd, he felt a little more at ease. He then retracted his gaze and followed Joka without saying a word. The place Joka mentioned was far away from the surface, but it was not the deepest part of the mine. According to Cohen, the deepest part of the mine was connected to Jorgandi Ridge. But Brando thought that it might be connected to the top layer of Jorgandi Ridge, which was the so-called Big Hive. The paths there extended in all directions, and it was difficult to find the way out if one got lost. It was also one of the biggest barriers between Jorgandi Ridge and the surface world. Not to mention that the Big Hive was also a place of danger. It was the habitat of many monsters, and it was not a peaceful place. But most of the mining areas were concentrated in the middle and upper levels. The two of them used a simple elevator to go deeper into the mine, and it took them about 10 minutes to reach the area where they were working. But as soon as they entered the underground, what happened next shocked Joka. The youth originally thought that Brendel would not be used to the low and oppressive environment in the mine, but in fact he was prepared to slow down his pace so that Brendel could keep up. The underground tunnel was not as spacious as the upper levels, and if he was not careful he would hit his head and bleed. But the reality was completely different from what he had imagined. Brendel was like a fish in water when he came here. The young man walked forward as if he was walking on flat ground, and he was even more skilled than Joka himself. There were even some techniques that Joka had never seen before. The young man was stunned. How was this a novice? In his opinion, an old miner who had worked in this industry for decades was nothing more than this. In the end, Joka didn't even know how he managed to keep up with them. The ground was extremely hot, and by the time he stopped, he was sweating profusely and gasping for breath. Joka never thought that there would be a day when he would be out of breath while chasing someone down there. It had been a long time since he became an apprentice. Then Brando lit up a light source. The air was quite thin down here and it was impossible to use a flame. He took out a fluorescent crystal for lighting. To save costs, the mine used the worst type of crystal, and it was only worth a few copper coins in the market. The crystal's light was so dim that it could be described as terrible, even weaker than a weak candle flame, but the light gray halo still carved out the uneven shadows of the surrounding stone walls. But I have to admit that Joka and the others chose a good place. There's a layer of light purple on the rocks, but it's not the original color of the silver ore. Maybe there's some kind of magic in the rocks. This was not uncommon, as there were often all kinds of magic-associated ores in Vaughn's veins. With Brando's rich experience, there should be a rich vein of ore behind the rocks. The quality of the ore should be good, and there might even be some valuable ores. As an old miner with more than 10 years of experience, Brando did not doubt his judgment. At this time he heard a series of footsteps coming from behind. He turned around and saw Cohen and Mar. Cohen and Mar were shocked when they saw them. "Joka, you're so fast?" Joka panted as he glanced at Brendel and nodded to his companions. "You chose a good place," Brando said as he looked at the youths and the walls. "Humph," Mar snorted, "you can see it? The light purple rocks mean that there is cold iron in the ore. It's a rare ore." Brando looked at the slanted patterns on the rocks and asked casually, "Have you found quartz here before?" "Quartz?" Mar was surprised. "What the hell is that?" "It's also called light blue crystal," Brando replied. "Isn't that a fake crystal? Why would there be something like that in a silver mine?" Mar shook his head in disdain. "If you're looking for that, then you've come to the wrong place." Brando shook his head. Diagonal quartz was not a type of quartz. It was a type of minuscule mana ore that could produce moonlight effect. Therefore it could also be considered as a type of moonstone. This type of ore was widely found in various large mineral veins. Although the inferior diagonal quartz was worthless, the best type of diagonal quartz was called magic eye gem. It was usually used as the most important part of the magic ring to store mana. Quartz in silver mines was usually of low quality, but it was in or associated with cold iron. Brando looked at the glowing walls and said, "Then you're digging in the wrong direction. If you keep digging in this direction you might find some cold iron ore." Mar and the other youths looked at each other. "How did you know? Why are you telling us?" If it was before yesterday they wouldn't have believed Brando. But things were different now. Brando didn't seem to have any reason to lie to them. Brendel was not lying to them. He was just speaking from his experience as an experienced miner. "Then how do we dig?" This time it was the girl behind Cohen who asked. Author's note: what a tragedy. I accidentally wrote the Flame King's name as something else. Just ignore it. I'll be more careful next time. Also, please support me. I seem to have contracted a disease where I will die if no one supports me. Looking at the tickets, subscriptions, and favorites that aren't increasing, I feel a little weak. Chapter 286. Frost iron ore was an extremely valuable mineral. According to the game, once a metal weapon was mixed with frost iron, it would increase the damage to monsters by the same ratio. A pure frost iron longsword was twice as powerful as a normal longsword to a monster. As any country in the world of Vaunt, they had to face the troubles of monsters for a long time, so the demand for frost iron was extremely high. However, this kind of ore only existed in silver mines, copper mines, and some crystal mines, so it was often priceless. In the market, frost iron was almost as valuable as gold, but the proportion of frost iron was much higher than gold, so it could be said that it was as valuable as gold. When Brando said that there was frost iron here, it naturally attracted the attention of the youths. If they could dig out some frost iron and find a way to secretly transport some of the ores to a suitable buyer, they would be able to earn an unimaginable amount of wealth. Of course, in reality, most people like them had some means to do some sneaky things. It wasn't that they didn't know about the mines, but they were too lazy to ask about them. After listening to the girl's question, Brando looked at them and thought that it was a good idea to use some small favors to buy their hearts. After all, he might need their help. He pointed at the slanted lines on the wall and said, "Dig along these lines, but I can't guarantee that we will be able to dig it out, but there will definitely be a rich mine behind." Cohen nodded, and under his signal, Mar picked up a pickaxe and dug in that direction. Then the others followed suit. Brando had no intention of digging. Instead, he turned around and looked at the other end of the tunnel. The dark tunnel stretched to the end of the light. "Where does it lead to?" He turned around and asked. "There's another layer below," Cohen replied. He didn't work because of his body, but it seemed that the others didn't mind. Brando even saw someone give a portion of the ores they dug out to the weak youth. But that layer has been abandoned. Brando, of course, knew why the lower layer was abandoned. Last night, the young man had said that it was because when they were mining, they had dug through the tunnel between the beehive and the beehive, causing the monsters to swarm out. After that, it was not easy to drive the monsters back, but since then, no one dared to go to the lower layer of the mine. After hearing Cohen's words, he looked over there and walked straight into the depths of the tunnel. "Wait," Cohen stopped him. "Sir, it's best if you wait a while." Brando stopped. "Why?" "The supervisor will come to check in a while." You'd better wait for him to leave before you go. The young man replied. When is he coming? 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour. Brando frowned. Will he come again? Yes, the supervisor will come every few hours, but it's hard to say exactly when. A few hours seems to be enough, Brando thought. He nodded. Thank you. At the same time he thought that this was the benefit of buying people's loyalty. He picked up the pickaxe and knocked on the wall twice. Under the power of his gold-ranked strength, the rocks fell down like a landslide. But what really surprised Joka and Mar was that the youth's movements were extremely skillful. The pickaxe went straight into the veins without any deviation. A layer of low-quality silver ore slid down to Brando's feet. He fiddled with it. At first he was a little interested, but after a while he just sat there and listened to the clanking of the pickaxe. Mar and the others dug quickly. The light purple wall was soon peeled away, revealing a layer of gray rock behind. Brando gestured for them to stop. He then had Joka throw a small piece of the rock over to him. He picked it up and studied it for a while. This is the diagonal quartz. Let's continue digging. You mean we have it? Cohen asked. Brando nodded. The youth's faces revealed faint expressions of excitement. They wanted to go to the outside world together, so naturally they would need a large sum of money. And right now it seemed like an opportunity to make a fortune. The speed of the pickaxes became faster, and the clanking sounds were incessant. Brendel watched as the youths threw away the unwanted rocks one by one, and some of them rolled to his feet. But when he looked at them he found that the quality of the quartz was getting better and better. Brando paused. This wasn't normal. Quartz was a product of magic, and it was usually found in high-purity crystal ores. It was the opposite for metal ores. He looked up and saw that Mar, Joka, and the others had stopped digging. After the gray rock was completely broken down, a deep blue vein was revealed. It was frost steel. However, what made them stop was not the frost steel, but the glowing crystals within the frost steel. Magic eye gems. There were 17 of them, and each one was the size of a thumb. He had never heard of anyone being able to dig out 17 magic eye gems in one go. Even the lowest grade magic crystal, the purple-yellow crystal which was used to make intelligence headwear, had not been dug out in one go, let alone the magic eye gems. He patted his cheeks as if he was dreaming. He immediately looked up and asked, "Do you know what this is?" Everyone shook their heads. Brando looked at the frost steel or vein that contained the magic eye gems. In fact, the vein itself was abnormally large. Brando looked at it and estimated that there were at least 1 or 2 tons of frost steel ore in it. This amount of frost steel was already quite terrifying. The cold iron was also a product of mana contamination, but Brendel could not figure out how this vein was so unique that it could allow so much mana to gather here and form such a huge vein. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. After a short pause he said, "These are magic eye gems. They're very useful to me." The youths fell silent. "Okay, we'll split it 50-50. Mar immediately said. In fact, it was quite unfair for them to split it 50-50. After all, Brando was only one person and there were 7 of them. But these youths knew that Brando was strong, and they were worried that he would be tempted by the wealth. But Brando shook his head. "I'll take them all. You can sell me your half too." He patted his waist. "I can pay immediately." Magic eye gems were the most important material for making magic rings, but that wasn't all. At least, Brando knew that the White Lion armor needed them. Even the long-lost wind-weaving bow of the Golden Elves needed them. 17 thumb-sized magic eye gems were enough to make 100 sets of armor. Brando couldn't help but think that this was really a case of traveling far and wide looking for something, only to find it by chance. The youths were silent for a while before Cohen asked, "How much are you willing to pay? You don't know the market price of the magic eye gem, so you won't be able to sell it." "I won't hide it from you, I'm only prepared to pay half the price," Brendel said calmly, "but even if it's half the price, I think it's enough to satisfy you." "How much is that?" the girl beside Cohen asked. 10 square gold coins. Everyone in the mine gasped. Square gold coins were the most common currency in the south, and 10 square gold coins were worth 13,000 tor. It wasn't a small sum. "You're really willing to pay that much?" Joka stammered. "Of course, together with your payment." The youth smiled awkwardly. He knew that Brando was joking with him. He had brought Brando down here and asked for 15 tor at most. The weak-looking youth didn't say a word. He nodded and gestured for his companions to pry out the crystals and give them to Brando. Brando paid without hesitation. He saw the youths nodding and biting the bag of gold coins as if they didn't believe that it was gold. But it was true that 15,000 tor was an astronomical sum for these youths. They wouldn't be able to earn that much even if they worked here for 10 years. Even if they sold the silver ores secretly, it would still be the same. Brando carefully put away the magic eye gems. The youth named Cohen asked, "Mister, do you want this cold iron?" Brando looked at the long cold iron vein. Of course he wanted it, but not now. Sooner or later this mine would be his. He shook his head. The youth sighed in pity. Without Brando it would be much more difficult for them to get the ores out. However, this accident was only a small interlude in the boring mining process. About half an hour later the supervisor finally arrived. He seemed to know the youths. Not only did he greet them, he even mistook Brando for a new member. Cohen, Mar, and Brando didn't deny it this time. After the supervisor left, Brando finally found a chance to go deeper into the ground. After bidding farewell to the youths, he followed the deep, dark underground tunnel to the lowest level of the mine. The crisscrossing tunnels had been abandoned many years ago. There wasn't a single trace of life in the cold underground. If a normal person were to walk in this place alone, they would definitely feel their hair stand on end. However, Brando was satisfied as he walked in the darkness. It was best if there was no one around. In the end, he stopped at a blocked passageway. After making sure that it was deep enough, he stretched out his hand and a sky-blue card of fate appeared in his palm. It was the wind spirit spider. P.S. You will die if you don't have anyone to support you. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 287. Who the hell is that guy? After Brando left, the youths began to whisper among themselves. Mar was the first to speak. He had been against them coming into contact with the mysterious guy since last night, but ever since Brando found the location of the cold iron mine and used a large sum of money to make a deal with him, he had to admit that dealing with Brando had its benefits. However, Joka, who was the first to deal with Brando, was a little worried. 13,000 tor was not a small sum, and he felt that it was too easy to get the money. He couldn't help but turn back to look at Cohen. This frail young man was the most knowledgeable among them, and not only that, Cohen also knew magic. Every time they were injured in the mining area or in a fight, Cohen would use magic to heal them. Although there was no magic that could heal wounds in an instant, it was at least more effective than herbs. Just like that, Cohen had already become the leader of the group. It was just that Mar wasn't too convinced of it. However, Joka knew that Mar was only feeling embarrassed because he was pulled down from his position as the leader of the mercenaries. "It's nothing," Cohen shook his head. "Let's continue digging. This has nothing to do with us." Just as he finished speaking, he heard a scream coming from the mine. It came from the direction of one of their companions. Everyone's heart skipped a beat as they stopped and looked over. There were many mysterious legends about the depths of the dark mine. Although no one had ever been there, they were willing to meet any accidents in such a place. However, they saw their companion running out in a panic. "Come and look over here," the young man hurriedly shouted. "What's wrong?" Cohen asked. "Cohen, you'll know when you come over." "I don't know what this is." Everyone was stunned again. Cohen exchanged glances with the others beside him, and then everyone leaned over together. However, they were stunned the moment they walked over. Behind the deep blue vein, which was obviously where the young man had mined, a silver edge was exposed behind the broken rock stratum. It was definitely not a rock, nor was it an ore. Instead, it looked like some kind of man-made object. The youth said anxiously, "Look at this." He picked up the pickaxe and showed it to the others. They saw that the tip of the pickaxe had been neatly shaved off, and the cut was as smooth as a mirror. "You made this." Cohen frowned. He did not know what it was either. The youth nodded. "That's a sword. It's so sharp." Mar immediately said, "I've heard that there are residents of the underworld below us. That must be their weapon." "Mar, why would a weapon from the underworld come here?" Someone else had a different opinion. "It's possible. Didn't the monsters come up here before?" "Mar, you idiot. That's because the workers dug a tunnel." This time, even Joka couldn't take it anymore. "But there wasn't any passage before we started digging, not to mention that the sword was buried in the rock." At the very least, he agreed with Mar about the sword. Mar was about to retort, but Cohen interrupted them. "Stop arguing. Let's dig it out and take a look." "Dig it out?" The girl was confused. "It's useless to us." "Cohen, I'm a little uneasy. Let's just leave it here." The youth hesitated, but his curiosity was piqued when he saw the silver gleam in the rock. He believed that Mar was right. It was something left behind by the residents of the underworld. However, he glanced at the pickaxe. Such a sharp weapon must be worth a fortune outside. "Dig it out," he said. Everyone nodded. The youth's exuberant curiosity eventually overcame their fear of the unknown. However, when Cohen, Mar, and Joka began to dig out the strange weapon that was buried deep underground, there was a huge commotion in the mining area. A terrifying rumor spread among the miners that a monster had been discovered in the lower levels of the mine. The rumor was so real that the supervisors had no choice but to send a group of soldiers to investigate. However, they never returned. In less than half an hour, a written report was placed on Perkins's desk. For the first time, the energetic young man in his 30s, according to Vaughn's calculations of course, felt that things were getting a little tricky. Perkins was able to come to this mine to work for Count Randner partly because he was valued by the latter, but it was also because of his connections with various parties, especially Countess Randner. As a nephew of Countess Randner's family, he hitched a ride to this mine and waited for his term to end before joining the Count's team of advisors. Perkins knew that this mine was highly valued by Count Randner, and anyone who could successfully gain the latter's trust would eventually become one of the Count's most trusted retainers. This was why he was filled with enthusiasm for this mission, and it could even be said that he came to this place full of pride. Everything seemed to be in order until this morning. The report woke him up from his daydream. The report stated that a giant spider was seen in the lower levels of the mine. Normal spiders would not grow to the size of a human's head, so it must be a monster. Perkins immediately broke out in cold sweat. He knew what happened in the mine more than a decade ago, and if the workers were to dig through the tunnel to Georgandy Ridge again, he could not imagine how serious the situation would be. The young man immediately felt that he could not relax. He repeatedly confirmed the situation in the mine, but the news was worse than the one before. When a group of soldiers disappeared into the mine, Perkins knew that he was in trouble. He knew that he had no ability to do so. He originally planned to get a more leisurely position in the mine that would attract Count Randner's attention, but he did not expect his luck to be so bad that he encountered the worst situation. Perkins was at a loss as to what to do. He slumped back into his seat, wondering if Count Randner would chop him into pieces if he lost the mine. This was what Coden saw when he opened the door to the mine. Coden, who had entered the gold-ranked realm 30 years ago and was one of Count Randner's most trusted subordinates, saw the young man in a daze. Even though he knew that Coden did not have much ability and that he was just a person who got in through the back door, he could not help but feel a sense of disdain in his heart. He knew that Coden did not have much ability, but he did not expect Coden to be completely useless. He coughed once and only then did he snap Perkins out of his dazed state. Perkins's gray eyes lit up when he saw Coden standing by the door. Of course, he recognized this old executive adjutant, guard captain, and the highest military officer in the mine. Coden was different from him. He was already Count Randner's right-hand man before the year of White Frost. Coden was here to manage the daily operations of the mine, and he was fully trusted by Count Randner. Even though Perkins had cursed Coden more than once for being a damned old man, he still knew that he had to show a certain amount of respect on the surface. Furthermore, Coden was very likely to be his savior at this moment. He shouted like a drowning man grabbing onto the last straw. "Mr. Coden, you're here. We're in big trouble now." "What do you mean by big trouble?" Coden said with a hint of disdain. However, Perkins didn't dare to be too calculative at a time like this. He hurriedly recounted everything that had happened. Coden had already understood most of the situation before he came here. In fact, he was already cursing in his heart. That damned bastard kept the news from him from the start, and only called him over when things got out of hand. If he knew the truth earlier, at least his soldiers would not have lost their lives for no reason. Coden was very unhappy at this moment, but he knew that this matter was of great importance. He could only suppress his dissatisfaction and ask coldly, "Oh, then what do you plan to do, Mr. Coden?" Perkins was stunned. He knew that Coden was using this opportunity to make him unhappy, but he knew that he had not handled this matter properly. He could only smile and say, "This? I'm not sure about the situation down there, but I'm worried that the miners will riot. I plan to send the guards down to maintain order." He looked at Coden's gloomy face and gulped. "That at least will need some people?" Coden snorted coldly and interrupted him. "Bullshit idea. If you send the guards down, won't the miners know that something is wrong down there? They'll only become more chaotic. There are thousands of miners in this mine, and you want to maintain order with less than 100 people? Aren't you thinking too much, Mr. Coden?" Perkins' face was almost disfigured by the scolding, but fortunately, he was thick-skinned and replied, "Then what should we do?" "I'll go down and take a look." Coden wiped the hilt of his sword. "Although the monsters down there are troublesome, they won't be able to stop me. I'll go down and see how serious the situation is. Good, good, good. Perkins said the word good 3 times. Although the matter was not resolved yet, he was relieved that Coden was going to take action. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 288. After releasing the wind spirit spiders, Brando immediately returned to the upper level. Hundreds of wind spirit spiders were crawling up the mine shaft. He knew that the panicked miners would soon spread the news to the surface. A similar incident had happened in Shaflund mine before, but the attackers were dino beasts from the beehive zone. The mine had suffered a huge loss of manpower and property. Now that a similar monster attack had occurred, the mine's manager, who had experienced it before, would definitely do something about it. Brando did not go back the way he came. Instead, he chose a different path. He advanced in the dark tunnel. His 20 perceptive sense allowed him to adapt to the dim light. The tunnel was so deep that he could not see his own fingers, but it was as bright as day in his eyes. He leisurely passed through a tunnel that the wind spirit spiders had once passed through. The workers here had long since fled in terror. The surroundings were empty, and there was not a single sound to be heard. Brando came to the elevator and activated the Magitech. The simple elevator slowly rose and brought him to the upper level. The next level was the tunnel that transported the ores to the surface. There was a wooden track on the floor and the space was higher. The walls were supported by sturdy wooden frames. However, under the light of the torch there was no one around. Most of the workers had fled. Brando walked out of the elevator and quickly found an inconspicuous mark on the rock layer. He followed the mark and turned a corner. Suddenly, a black shadow lurked in the shadows and lunged at him like a venomous snake. Brando's cheek was stung by the sharp blade, but he reacted quickly. He raised his hand and blocked the hand that was holding the sword. Just as he was about to counterattack, he recognized the sword. His left hand immediately grabbed his opponent's wrist and forced him to drop the sword. He heard a clang as the sword fell to the ground, followed by a soft groan of pain. It was a woman's voice. "My lord." Yuta finally recognized Brando. The red-haired, blue-eyed female commander frowned and hugged her wrist. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it was you." She knew that Brendel was powerful, but she did not expect him to be this powerful. Among the 3 leaders, only Cornelius knew Brendel's true strength. The others did not have a clear understanding of his strength before. Brendel merely grabbed her wrist and exerted some force, and she felt as though her entire body was tied up. Her wrist felt like it was broken and she could not move at all. Yuta rubbed her wrist and was speechless. She was also a silver tier, but she was restrained the moment she made a move. Was there such a huge gap between gold and silver tier? "Where are Scarlet and Medisha?" Brando asked. "They are on the other side." "My lord, why did you call us here?" "It's a little troublesome to lure the enemy out." "We need to change our plan." Brendel flicked out his sword and sent the sword flying into the air. The sword hit the wall and bounced back, but he caught it and passed it back. "I have a plan. I received news that there was a serious accident in the Shaflund mine more than 10 years ago. The miners dug through the tunnels leading to Jorgendi Ridge, which led to the invasion of monsters. My lord, are you going to use this method to lure him out?" Medisha's voice came from behind Yuta. Brando saw the Silver Fairy Princess and Scarlet coming out from behind. They had heard the commotion. The girl recognized the wind spirit spiders that Brando had summoned, and she easily came to a conclusion. Brando nodded. "The captain of the guards is called Coden. He personally led the guards to drive the monsters out of the mine in the last accident. This time he will most likely remember his experience. It's not a bad place to fight." The red-haired girl flicked her long ponytail and looked up at the ceiling. "But aren't you afraid of causing a collapse? Let's just end it quickly. The enemy is an intermediate gold tier. It is a little tricky." Brendel furrowed his brows. His opponent was not a greenhorn, but a gold-ranked swordsman with plenty of experience. "But I don't have a better idea at the moment." The 3 of them suddenly stopped talking. They heard footsteps coming from the other side of the mine. The footsteps were messy but not panicked. It must be the guards patrolling the mine. However, only Brando, who had the highest level among the 4 of them, heard the faint sound of footsteps. Although the level of an elementalist did not increase Brando's strength, it greatly improved his perception. Although Brando's absolute strength was only a lower gold tier, his perception was actually higher than Coden's. At the very least, he was above the intermediate gold tier. He immediately put his index finger to his lips and made a shushing gesture. He warned Medisha and Scarlet with his eyes that the big fish was approaching. Although Yuta did not know what was going on, she knew what was going on when she saw the serious expressions on their faces. Koden did not enter the mine alone. He said that he would go alone, but it was just an excuse. The mine was huge and complex, and the master swordsman would not be able to take care of it alone. He brought a small group of 10 people with him. However, the strange thing was that the spiders mentioned in the report seemed to have disappeared the moment he entered the mine. He and his men patrolled the first and second floor, but they did not find any of the monsters in the rumors. Koden could not help but feel suspicious. He almost thought that someone was deliberately spreading the rumor, but the group of soldiers that went missing reminded him that there was something wrong. When Koden reached the third level, he discovered that the tunnels were empty. The miners had long since escaped upwards, leaving the place in a silent and desolate world. For the first time, the master swordsman sensed that something was wrong. They followed the wooden tracks and searched. The Shaflun silver mine was so complicated that the soldiers had to check the map as they walked. But at that moment, Koden heard a sound. It seemed like someone was talking in front of him. He did not dare to confirm it, so he immediately ordered his men to spread out and move forward cautiously. But when he found out the source of the sound, he and his men were stunned. There was a woman there. To be exact, it was a little girl with silver hair and silver eyes. Not only that, but she also had pointy ears. The soldiers could only recognize that she was an elf, but Koden was a knight. Not only did he learn etiquette in a noble family, but he also read books about geography and history. The old man recognized her at a glance. She was the legendary silver elf. He rubbed his eyes and almost thought that he was presbyopic or that he had seen a ghost. The silver elves had disappeared hundreds of years ago, and any books that mentioned them would use the word legend in front of them. But now this legend was standing right in front of him. Koden was surprised, but he did not let his guard down. Suddenly, he heard a slight movement behind his ear. He immediately turned around and saw 2 people behind him. One of them was a young man wearing a gray-white leather armor, and there were 5 or 6 long swords hanging from his waist. Koden was stunned when he saw the young man. Why does he have so many swords? What kind of school does he belong to? But Koden immediately saw a young mercenary girl with a halberd following behind the young man. The old swordsman suddenly realized that he was no longer in the mood to care about the silver elves. Instead, he connected the dots and realized that these people were here for him. But he did not ask any nonsense like, "Who are you?" He raised his eyebrows and asked, "How much money did Jera give you?" Brando was stunned. "Then who are they?" Scarlet asked in confusion. "Humph," Koden drew his sword. "If they are not sent by my old enemy, then they must be the Count's enemies. But it's all the same, come and die." Under his command, the soldiers unsheathed their swords. Even though Koden's hair was white, he still looked majestic and awe-inspiring. It was as if he had lost his courage in the past. Count Randner had 13 knights that he trusted the most. Among them, Baldron and Sean were the strongest, but Koden was the only one who had participated in the 10 Years' War. He was also one of the top 5 knights in terms of strength. It was rumored that the old swordsman obtained gold-rank strength 30 years ago, and he was now a middle-ranked knight. He pulled out his sword from its scabbard. But Yuta, who was hiding far away, had a different thought when she saw the scene. She glanced at Brando. Koden, the captain of Shaflun's guards, obtained gold-rank strength 30 years ago, but he was already a middle-aged man in his 50s at that time. Now that he was old, he was only a middle-ranked gold-ranked knight. Compared to this young lord, a mortal is indeed different from a monster, she thought. When Koden saw Brando unsheathing his sword, he did not think much of it and wondered who sent 3 immature fools to cause trouble for him. But when he saw the young man releasing his aura, the air around him suddenly turned cold, and a layer of white frost began to spread from his feet, causing his eyelids to twitch. Elemental activation, gold-rank strength. Such a young gold-rank swordsman? But the old swordsman's shock did not end there. He immediately saw the electric arcs on Scarlet's halberd and arms, as well as the layer of white spiritual energy that condensed around Medisha's body. He immediately felt his heart skip a beat. 3 opponents who had entered the gold stage. But who would be willing to send 3 geniuses here to cause trouble for him? He looked like he was in his 20s, but he was already a gold-ranked swordsman. This kind of person would attract attention no matter where he went, and would not be sent here to be an assassin. Koden subconsciously took a step back, but it was not to show weakness. Being surrounded by 2 gold-ranked opponents, even he had to consider how to protect himself. P.S. The condition of "I will die without support" has improved a little, but to fully recover, I still have to rely on the support of my fellow students. Chapter 289. The first to attack was Brando. Coden did not dare to be careless in the face of a famous master swordsman. He immediately unleashed the White Raven sword style. The sword shattered from top to bottom, but the wind pressure from the sword formed a crescent-shaped gust of wind that swept towards Coden and his soldiers. The air was either compressed into a thin blade, or pushed away by a huge force. However, the gust of wind that was pushed away was equally lethal. With a few loud bangs, the gust of wind had already broken the wooden pillars that supported the walls on both sides of the cliff. Scarlet could not help but glance at the tunnel, worried that it would collapse at any moment. However, even the sturdy wood could not withstand the impact of the cyclone, not to mention the guards who had not even reached the level of iron. The wind from the sword swept through the entire corridor, and the 10 guards immediately fell to the ground. If they were not beheaded, then they were cut in half at the waist. The White Raven sword style was an intermediate-level swordsmanship, and Coden did not dare to take the attack head-on. He leaped up to avoid the sharpest part of the sword and used his hand to break through the cyclone at the top of the tunnel. At the same time he thrust his sword towards Brando. These veterans who had experienced 10 years of war were most familiar with the classic Erewhon military swordsmanship, and Coden was no exception. However, Brando was very familiar with this style of swordsmanship. He quickly retreated when he saw Coden's attack, and Scarlet caught up with him. Clang! She raised her halberd and blocked the sword. Lower gold tier. Coden immediately judged Scarlet's strength. Get out of my way! The old man roared and pressed his sword downwards. Scarlet's eyes widened in shock, and she took 7 steps back before she could stop herself. Coden was also shocked. He thought that Scarlet would at least retreat to the side of the tunnel, but she stopped at such a short distance. Obviously, he did not expect Scarlet's physique to be far superior as an oracle. As soon as the old man landed on the ground, he immediately launched an attack on Brando, who was retreating. The captain's goal was very clear. He wanted to break through, but how could Brando let him do as he wished? Although the sword in his hand had shattered, he was already prepared and immediately pulled out another long sword. Coden finally understood why the young man had prepared so many swords, but it was a joke that a gold-rank swordsman didn't have a sword that suited him. The old man sneered and took a step forward. The long sword in his hand was like a silver chain as it slashed down towards Brando. That sword move could not be said to be exquisite. It was just the most basic sword move of a battle formation sword art. However, when this old swordsman used it, it felt as if the sky was falling and the earth was cracking, as if Mount Tai was pressing down on him. Holy *T. Brando felt that he had made a mistake in his judgment. Whether it was Conrad or Turst, none of the gold-rank swordsmen he had seen before could compare to this old man. Even Buga, who was stronger than him, did not give him as much pressure as Coden. Brando knew the reason. The former was just a swordsman while the latter was a soldier. He had only seen this kind of aura and swordsmanship from one person in this world. The White Knight, Ebden. It could be said that other than the Oracle of the Earth, Ebden was the one who forced Brando into a corner the most. Ebden was only a silver-ranked swordsman. Although Brando's own strength was weak, others might not be able to do the same. The soldier's swordsmanship was unrestrained, with an innate killing intent and aura. It was as if he was not wielding a sword but a wall. It gave people the illusion that there was no way to avoid it and that a great disaster was about to befall them. Ebden's swordsmanship was one of the best, and Coden was a veteran who had fought in the war for 10 years. His swordsmanship was far superior to Ebden's, and even Brendel, who had been on the battlefield for a long time, felt a chill run down his spine. However, ashes were ashes after all. Brando gritted his teeth and dodged to the side, causing Coden's sword to miss. The sword hovered in the air, but the air current lashed down like a whip. With a loud bang, a 10-meter-long dent appeared in the ground. The entire tunnel seemed to tremble. Brando's scalp went numb. For the first time he felt that it was not a wise choice to fight Coden here. No matter how he looked at it, the tunnel would not be able to withstand their attacks. However, Coden did not seem to mind. He was slightly surprised that Brando was able to dodge his attack. His gray eyebrows twitched slightly. However, he did not slow down and immediately swung his sword towards Brando. He wanted to force Brando away. This series of attacks happened in the blink of an eye. Scarlet had just stabilized herself. Brando saw Medisha rushing towards him, but she was still a step away. Coden's sword was right in front of him, but he could not retreat. However, Brando was furious. Do you think I'm a sick cat if I don't show my might? He activated Charge, and with a burst of speed, he disappeared from Coden's sight. When he reappeared, he had already dodged Koden's sword and stabbed towards his throat. What incredible speed! Koden could tell that this was the Sun Knight's skill. He blocked the attack with his own hand. When their swords clashed, both of them could tell that the other's understanding of swordsmanship was different. They were both Erwin's battle formation swordsmanship, but at this moment, it was time to determine who was better. Koden was excited, but when he saw Brando take a step back and his sword slanted to the side, his eyes flashed. This isn't Erwin's battle formation swordsmanship. Koden immediately took a step back and blocked Medish's spear with his own sword. However, he did not take any further action. Instead, he shouted in a deep voice, "Stop!" When Brando and Koden began to fight, the entire tunnel shook a few times. Joka felt sand falling on his shoulder. He touched it with his hand and looked up at the top of the tunnel. He could not help but ask worriedly, "What's going on? Did the tunnel collapse?" He turned to his companions and asked, "Did you guys feel it?" Mar and the others were busy digging. They had almost dug out the object from the wall. Because it was too sharp, they had no choice but to start from the sides and slowly push this shiny silver object out of the gradually sunken rock wall. When the rock layer was peeled away, they could see the outline of the object. It was not a sword but more like a silver sphere. But why is it so sharp? They could not figure it out. The sphere slowly protruded from the wall. Some of them even touched it carefully, but it was not a big deal. This made them feel relieved. But at this time, the girl shivered. "I feel a little cold." She looked around anxiously as if something was hiding in the darkness. The temperature seems to have dropped. Cohen's attention was focused on the silver sphere. There was a faint golden color on its surface. He had read about this metal in a book left behind by a monk, Mithril. The young man's eyes couldn't help but burn. In his memory, compared to the value of Mithril, winter iron was no different from a rock. He shook his head after hearing what the girl and Joka said. "There are occasional tremors in the mine, but they're very small. There's nothing to be surprised about. Don't scare yourself." Then he turned around and said, "You know what, we're rich now." He smiled. "Now we don't have to go out and make a living. We can live the life we want." However, before he could finish his sentence, Mar suddenly exclaimed in surprise. Everyone turned to look at him. After Mar swung his pickaxe down, a large chunk of the rock wall suddenly fell off, revealing a layer of smooth black rock behind. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned. They thought that the blue cold iron or vein was at least 1.5 meters deep, but they didn't expect there to be such a thing behind it. "This isn't natural," someone suddenly shouted. "Look, there are words on it." Everyone looked over and sure enough, they saw a row of densely packed words written on the black rock wall. However, it seemed that because of the passage of time, the words had already become blurred. No one could see what was written on it. Cohen slowly walked over and touched it. It was cold to the touch. He turned his hand over and saw a patch of black on it. "It's rust," he said. "This is iron." "What is it?" someone asked. The other youths looked at each other. Cohen did not know how to answer. He had some knowledge, but it was limited. This strange excavation made him feel a little nervous, but there was also a faint excitement. Even in the young man's confused state of mind, he could roughly guess that he had dug up something incredible. "Come, let's continue digging. We'll dig it out." Mar was a man of action. "Wait, you know what it is?" Joka said in annoyance. He had been worried since the beginning. "Plus it's so big. You won't be able to bring it out even if you dig it out." The last sentence moved Mar. He stopped and looked at Cohen with a questioning gaze. "Let's dig out the silver ball first." Cohen checked the iron wall and found nothing. He lost interest and decided to get the actual benefits first. But this time, as soon as he finished speaking, the entire tunnel shook. This time it was different from before. It was as if the entire tunnel was shaking violently. All the youths were shaken to the ground at the first moment. "Look, that thing is glowing," a voice suddenly shouted amidst the screams. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 290. Koden took a step back and used his sword to deflect the silver elf princess spear as he shouted, "Stop!" But right at this moment, just as everyone's movements became sluggish, the ground in the mine suddenly began to shake. Brando, Medisha, and Scarlet's expressions changed and they looked up instinctively. Crack! A 10-meter-long fissure appeared on the ceiling of the mine. Sand and gravel fell from the fissure and hit everyone's faces. This sudden turn of events interrupted the battle, and Brendel immediately lowered his head and squinted his eyes. He turned around and shouted for Scarlet behind him to quickly retreat. He knew something was wrong, but the mine was more fragile than he thought. Brendel naturally concluded that this was the result of several gold-ranked forces fighting below, but he had a vague feeling that something was wrong. Their battle with Coden had only just begun. Logically speaking, it shouldn't have caused such a huge commotion. But he didn't have time to think about it. As he retreated, Scarlet suddenly shouted from the other side, "My lord, be careful." But before she could finish her sentence, Schaffelin's mind began to tremble for the second time. Huge rocks finally broke free from the mountain's shackles and crashed down. The light in the mine suddenly became chaotic and dim. Brando wanted to avoid it, but a large amount of sand and gravel rushed towards him. Damn it. That was his last thought before everything turned dark. The terrifying tremors from the underground even reached the surface. The young noble clerk who was restraining the workers in the mine lost his balance and fell down. With great difficulty, Perkins crawled up from the rubble with his head bleeding. He felt the ground beneath his feet trembling and rumbling. He could not help but turn pale and look around in panic. The entire mine was in chaos. Most of the miners had been thrown to the ground, but even more people were running away. What's going on? An earthquake? Is Lady Martha angry? Perkins couldn't help but shudder. Frada in the Moon of Frost had a hint of desolation. Griffin's pale silver eyes reflected a glimmer of light as she looked out from the balcony. In the distance, the white fog seemed to be dragging the canopy of a forest with thick ink like ink. Some of the trees had already lost most of their leaves. But the fireplace in the room was still burning. Sparks from the red charcoal occasionally drifted out of the iron fence and onto the red bricks outside the fireplace. The room became warmer. Her Royal Highness only had a red and white fur shawl draped over her nightgown. Her long silver hair was a little messy and floppy, as if she was sleepy. Under her nightgown she was barefooted. She lowered her head and absent-mindedly placed her small white feet on the fluffy carpet. She watched her white skin sink into the soft fluffy fur and then smiled. Of course, Aberbeck couldn't see what was going on under the table. Otherwise, he would have scolded the princess, who was half his student, and told her to pay attention to her appearance and behavior. However, the old vassal's gaze was more focused on the document on the table. It was actually 3 days after the knight's tournament. The document was personally delivered by Maynard. The female knight was standing beside Aberbeck, one step behind him. She was wearing a black knight's robe. The skin on her hands and neck was as white as porcelain. She stood straight and looked straight ahead. The room was silent for a moment. After a while, Princess Griffin recovered from her low blood pressure. She rubbed her forehead and lifted her silver eyes weakly as if she was tired. Her 2 subjects were reflected in her pupils. "I'm sorry, Aberbeck Maynard. I woke up a little late." "Rest well. Strike a balance between work and rest." It wasn't Aberbeck who said this but the female knight. Aberbeck turned to look at her. The female knight was expressionless, but the vassal wasn't surprised. He had always been like this, out of concern for the princess. It wasn't just out of concern for the queen. "What is this?" Princess Griffin took a look at the report written on the parchment. She frowned and placed her hand on a crystal shard the size of a fist. The shard immediately lit up and images appeared on it. Upon closer inspection, it was a record of the knight's tournament a few days ago. However, the image of a young girl was shown. The princess recognized that it was Freya. She paused for a moment and replayed it. Princess Griffin looked up and asked curiously, "Is there a problem?" "Swordsmanship," Maynard replied. "Swordsmanship? There's a problem with that little girl's swordsmanship." This time it was Aberbeck who answered. "Isn't that Everton's daughter? What problem could there be?" the young girl asked. Maynard nodded and took out a bell and shook it. The bell rang and the door opened. A young knight wearing a chest plate and a red cloak with white fur leaned forward and asked, "What orders do you have, Lady Maynard?" "Attack me," the female knight ordered concisely. The knight was slightly surprised, but he didn't ask any questions. He opened the door and took a step back, then immediately drew his sword. As a knight of the royal family, he had the strength of a gold tier, and his attacks were clean and efficient. However, Maynard simply took a step back and dodged his first attack. The young girl dodged to the side and at the same time closed the distance between her and the knight. She drew her sword halfway and pressed it against the knight's neck. Half of her body leaned forward and pressed the knight to the ground with her sword. In the blink of an eye, Maynard held her half-unsheathed sword to the knight's neck with one hand in front of the other, and the knight fell to the ground on his butt. "Maynard, your swordsmanship has improved again." The half-elf girl's eyes lit up. However, the knight who was sitting on the ground was not depressed at all. He held Maynard's hand and stood up. He lowered his head and replied, "I'm sorry to disappoint you. Maynard had always been the Griffin Knight. Gravato? She was the knight captain of Oderfice's royal guards. Although they weren't completely in the same system, she could still command the knights of the royal guards. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was half the boss of these knights." Towards this female boss, although there were some dissenting voices, most of the young knights in the knight regiment were convinced and looked forward to her. In the words of a jealous person, this female knight was already notorious for her ferocity. Maynard nodded and did not say much. Instead, she kept her sword and replied to Princess Griffin, "This is a military swordsmanship, a swordsmanship that was born to end a battle quickly." The silver-haired girl thought for a moment and said, "I don't remember our country's military swordsmanship being like this." "Because it has been modified," Oberbeck replied. "This is a modified military swordsmanship. It focuses on the technique, not the technique. The core of this swordsmanship is to use the simplest method to cause the enemy to lose their ability to fight." The minister pointed to his neck, waist, arms, and thighs. "Usually it's to kill, but there are other methods. However, those who have not accumulated experience in battle would not be able to use this swordsmanship." Griffin fell into deep thought. She placed her hand on the crystal again and replayed the image. She noticed the second half of Freya's last strike. "You're talking about this?" The female knight nodded. "After Miss Maynard told me about this, I observed it carefully." Oberbeck replied, "This little girl's move to snatch the sword was purely improvised, but the attack after that has the shadow of a military swordsmanship." The half-fairy princess frowned, but immediately relaxed and revealed a look of interest. "You said that this swordsmanship requires a long period of experience in battle, but she did not have such experience. She used to be a militia in Bucci and participated in the war with Madara, but it was only for a few days." "Yes. But there is another possibility." Oberbeck lowered his head and replied, "She is a veteran." "You mean someone taught her? That Martin?" Griffin asked. "No, I sent someone to investigate this old guard captain. He is very capable and experienced the November War, but he is just an ordinary veteran." Yes, his other disciple did not know this swordsmanship either. Griffin nodded. She was referring to Breton. But there was another possibility, and that was that Freya was a genius, and did not need a long period of time to comprehend her own understanding of swordsmanship. But Freya's ability was obvious to everyone present, so this possibility was not mentioned. Who could it be? Griffin was puzzled. She does not know anyone else. "There is another person who is out of our sight, Your Highness." Griffin immediately reacted, and a strange light flashed in her silver eyes. "You mean him?" Oberbeck nodded. The half-fairy princess quickly calmed down. "But he is just a young man unless someone taught him." She tilted her head. "Then do you know more about him?" Griffin suddenly realized that when she asked this question, there was a strange expectation in her heart. Was it to find out more about this matter? Or was it to find out more about him? Perhaps it was a combination of both, but the princess herself did not know. "Unless he can return to Bucci." "You did not get any information from the people who escaped from Bucci? They are not familiar with him." Maynard interrupted. "I even sent someone to ask Breton privately, but he said he did not know." "He said he did not know." Griffin thought for a moment. "But he said he did not know?" Maynard nodded. She also felt that there was a problem, but she could not find any more clues. "Let's put it aside for now." Griffin ran her fingers through her silver hair and adjusted the silver band at the back of her head. "Let's go back to the matter. Can this swordsmanship be popularized?" "That little girl cannot." Miss Maynard observed her for a while, and she did not know much about it. Oberbeck shook his head. "Unless we can find that person." Griffin raised her head and asked. "Right?" Both of them nodded. Griffin looked at the knight. "Maynard, can't you restore this swordsmanship to its original state? You are one of the rare swordsmanship geniuses in the kingdom, can't you do anything?" she asked. Maynard seemed to be thinking about something. At this moment she regained her senses. "I will try my best, but do not have too much hope. After all, I'm not a warrior." "I mean, this swordsmanship cannot be restored without a certain amount of battle experience." The knight replied calmly. "I understand. I will ask Oberbeck to help you. Ask him to find a few veterans who experienced the November War to discuss this with you." Griffin thought for a moment. "In the near future, other than preparing for the trip to Ampere Seal, spend more time on this matter. I am very optimistic about the promotion of this swordsmanship, so I will have to trouble the two of you. This old one understands. Yes. Maynard nodded slightly. P.S. Everyone, have you ever seen someone who subscribed to 999 Qigyan coins last month and was just short of 1 Qigyan coin, only to end up with no monthly votes this month? Chapter 291. The sound of water dripping came from the darkness. Brando's eyelids twitched, and he finally woke up from the pitch-black environment. He felt that his surroundings were silent, as if he had returned to the beginning of the world. After groaning, his consciousness gradually became clearer, and he subconsciously opened his status panel to take a look. When the faint green light screen appeared out of nowhere in the darkness, Brando finally felt a little more at ease. The status showed that he did not have any fractures or internal injuries, and there were not even any large wounds, just some abrasions and impacts. He then realized that he was worrying too much, and the strength of his body after entering the Golden Realm was not just for show. However, the surroundings were still pitch black and there was no light. Even if his perception was high, he could not see in complete darkness. However, when he tried to take out the fluorescent gem, he immediately realized that a large amount of heavy earth and rocks were pressing down on his body, making him unable to move. Brando then remembered the scene when he was hit by the collapsed earth and rocks, and that was the main reason why he fainted. But he could not help but feel lucky. If it was a normal person, even if he was lucky enough to escape, he would not be able to escape the fate of suffocation. But then again, if he was just a normal person, he would have died in butchie. Taking a deep breath, Brando extended his arms outwards, and the power of more than 100 ounces immediately shook the earth and rocks, rolling down. Then he tried again, and with the addition of power burst, he finally broke the earth and rocks pressing down on him. Once he broke free, Brando immediately patted the sand off his body and stood up, but he subconsciously wiped his forehead, and felt that his hand was cold. Stunned for a moment, he immediately took out the fluorescent gem, and under the pale light, he saw that his hand was covered in blood. Brando cursed and then looked around. The situation outside made him sigh in relief. After the collapse of the tunnel, the passage was not completely sealed, at least there was still a way out. The passage was at the other end of the tunnel, and the torches on the rock wall had long been extinguished, and he did not know where it led to. At this moment, the surrounding environment had greatly changed, and even Brando could not distinguish between north, south, east, and west. He was about to raise the gem and shine it in that direction, but suddenly he heard a groan behind him. Brando was stunned for a moment before he recalled everything that had happened before the earthquake. He turned around and saw the girl from the Grey Wolves mercenaries lying quietly on the other side of the rubble. Scarlet's eyes were tightly shut, and her sharp face was as pale as a sheet of paper under the pale light. Her eyelashes were trembling slightly, but they reflected a rare kind of quiet and gentle beauty. However, the young man was not in the mood to pay attention to this beauty. Instead, he was paying attention to the pool of blood that was dripping from the other party's forehead. This was somewhat abnormal. The strength of an oracle's body was far greater than that of a human's. Logically speaking, Scarlet should not have suffered such superficial wounds. He suddenly thought of a bad guess, so he slowly walked over and squatted down beside her. He reached out and touched the girl's forehead. It was boiling hot. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He let go of his hand and saw that there was a layer of faint black patterns under the girl's pale forehead. It was growing along her cheeks. This meant that Scarlet's will was fighting against the blood of God. Every time she fell into a coma, it was a serious test for her. Brando thought for a moment, took out a water skin and poured some water on his palm. He then took out the crystal that was once infused with the blood of God and placed it on her forehead. "Scarlet, wake up!" He shouted twice, and to his relief, the girl's eyelids finally moved under the light, and then she opened her eyes. Her pupils seemed to be shrouded in a terrible layer of black and red at first, but after a while they returned to normal. They turned into a pair of amber burning with a vigorous flame. The burning flame seemed to be the power of life, symbolizing a tenacious will. "Scarlet?" Scarlet was in a daze at first, but then she reacted. She looked at Brando in confusion and asked weakly, "Commander?" It's me." Brando put away the crystal and answered. The red-haired girl hesitated for a moment and said, "My lord?" Then she closed her eyes quietly. She vaguely remembered that she had a nightmare. In her dream, she dreamt that she was buried under a blood-red tree. The tree's roots pierced into her body, and the crimson roots wrapped around her, constantly extracting her blood, but she couldn't move at all. This was not the first time she had such a dream, but this time it was particularly clear. She felt a little uneasy and subconsciously thought that the nightmare might be related to the blood of God in her body. Yes, how is it? Is it okay? Brando asked worriedly when he saw Scarlet close her eyes. The red-haired girl moved and immediately groaned in pain. She felt that her leg had been injured. Looking down, she found a long wound. Blood was seeping out of her battle robe, dyeing it red. She was a little nervous. Although the rock was sharp, it was not enough to hurt people with their level of strength. Not to mention that she was actually an oracle. Her body's toughness, resistance, and recovery ability were even better than Brando's. This was not normal. The uneasiness in her heart grew stronger. She subconsciously tried to sit up, but the pain made her groan and lie back down. She laid on the ground and gasped for breath. Her forehead was full of cold sweat, but she did not feel the pain at all. Instead, her mind was filled with another thought. Where is my power? She clearly remembered that she had gained the power of gold after she became an oracle. Didn't the Lord say the same thing? But she felt that she had no power at all. It was a feeling she had not felt for many years. She was weak and powerless just like an ordinary person. Her power disappeared. The girl laid on the ground, her eyes out of focus. She suddenly felt a little helpless. When Makarov disbanded the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she had such an experience. Everything that she could rely on in the past seemed to have lost its meaning. It was as if she was choked by a great despair. She could not breathe. It was Brando who brought her out of this hopeless situation. The young lord gathered most of the original members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries and gave her a reason to continue living. It was not easy for her to walk out of this shadow and adapt to a new life. It could even be said that she liked this kind of life. At least in the past, the most outstanding people in Makarov's eyes were Eek and Yuta. She was just an insignificant member. But in this place, whether it was because of the power of gold from the blood of God or not, at least she could feel that Brando valued her. Her existence was not insignificant. She was also one of the most important forces in the Lord's group. Moreover, she could continue to fight side by side with the original members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. This made Scarlet feel satisfied even if it was very short. She had expected that she would one day become an oracle and lose everything she had now. But she did not expect that Martha was playing a joke on her. When she just blended into the environment, she found that her power had completely disappeared. Right now, she was no different from a normal person. She was even weaker than a normal person. But she knew that a noble did not need a useless retainer. Even though she was also a normal person, she admitted that she was not as smart and knowledgeable as Martha. She could not help but tremble when she thought of this. What's wrong? Brando saw that Scarlet's face was pale and did not say a word. My lord. Scarlet said in a small voice, I don't have any power. Brando was stunned. It was normal to lose too much blood, but he felt that it was a little strange. Logically speaking, an oracle's body should not be so heavily injured. But what was even stranger was Scarlet's strange words. This girl was lying on the ground, her face pale and weak. She said to him weakly, My lord, I don't have any power. What does this mean? Is she asking me to help her up? If it was a young Roman, Brando could understand. But in his impression, Scarlet was an introverted girl. Not to mention acting coquettishly, she was almost as expressionless as Falerne. There must be a reason for this abnormality. Brando carefully observed to see if Scarlet had become an oracle. She pretended to be like this to ambush him, but he was very familiar with the signs of an oracle. She did not look like she was controlled by the blood of gods. He showed a puzzled expression, But Scarlet's mind was in a mess. She did not notice Brando's confusion. Her mind was filled with the ruthless look of Makarov, who she regarded as both a father and a teacher. She could not help but repeat her words, My lord, I don't have any power left. I'm afraid I can't keep up with you. Brando was stunned again. What's going on? However, he suddenly understood and asked tentatively, You've lost your gold power? Scarlet's face paled and nodded slowly. I see. Brando nodded. This time, it was Scarlet's turn to be stunned. Scarlet had imagined Brando's reaction more than once. She was afraid that the same thing would happen again. But she did not expect Brando's reaction, as if he suddenly realized something. It's nothing. Brando shook his head. He knew that what happened to Scarlet was not a good sign. It meant that the conflict between the blood of gods had intensified. When she regained her power, she would become a true oracle. It would not take too long. It would take at most a few days or at least a few hours. At that time, her power would reach a new level, but she would no longer be her original self. But of course he could not tell her directly. He comforted her, It's all right. Can't you stand up? Scarlet was completely stunned. She nodded in confusion. Brando extended his hand. "Let me help you." Brando's voice was not loud when he said this. It was even a little gentle out of sympathy for the poor girl. Scarlet felt as if his words had penetrated all defenses and hit her heart. She felt tears welling up in her eyes. P.S. These 2 chapters are written very smoothly. Is this love? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.